Today, we're going to cover 3 wild medical mysteries. And if you like this kind of content, remember we have a whole award-winning podcast called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where all we do is cover stories just like these every single week. So make sure you check that out. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please swat the like button like it's a fly hovering over your food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but it was kind of hard. She was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Now, despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. They lived together, they shared everything. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. Janet thought her and Richard would be together forever. Clearly, if you're writing him into your will. And she assumed that that feeling was reciprocated, that Richard also felt like they were together forever. But lately, their relationship had gotten pretty rocky, and in fact, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Now, nothing was set in stone, and by no means were they destined for a breakup, but it was suddenly, a possibility, and that was really hard for Janet to deal with. And so, as Janet sat upstairs trying to do these bank statements, but, getting completely sidetracked just by the sound of Richard's voice, part of the reason that was so distracting is, Richard was all she could think about. What would happen if they broke up? What would her life look like? And so before long, her mind was kind of wandering, and no longer was it the bank statements. It was, what does the future hold for me? It seems so uncertain. And so as Janet is having this moment upstairs, she suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And at first, it kind of sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he had been talking to. But the more Janet listened, she could tell it really wasn't that he was yelling as much as he was screaming, like he was screaming out in pain or something. And so Janet got out of her chair and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And when she did, she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. And before she could even begin to process who this guy was and what he was doing here, she heard the sound of Richard again kind of calling out in pain, less loudly this time, but definitely in real pain. Then she turned, and sure enough, there was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing like something was really hurting him. And so Janet, she walked over to him and she's like, what's going on? Like, what's wrong with you? And who was that guy? And tell me, what's happening here? And so Richard, through gritted teeth, would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy who had just given it to him was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? Why are you having somebody come here to administer it? That's unusual. But, as she was thinking about this, she could clearly see that what was really important right now was that Richard was in agonizing pain. He was holding his arm and kind of rocking back and forth, moaning. Clearly, he was having some sort of reaction to the shot. And so she forgot about the weirdness around why he got the shot and how he got the shot, and said to him, hey, do you want to go to the hospital? I can drive you. And at this, Richard kind of sat up straight and took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself down. And even though obviously his shoulder still hurt from the shot, he said to Janet that, the guy from the NHS told me this was normal. There's pain associated with this particular shot, and it would just go away on its own. And so I'm just gonna wait and let this thing fade. At this point, Janet was still worried about Richard, but, he seemed pretty confident that this was not a big deal. And so she decided she would simply follow his lead. And she said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And then she turned and she went upstairs and continued trying to do her bank statements. But 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital. Because over those 48 hours since Richard got that COVID shot, The spot on his arm, the injection site, had turned red and began to blister and bleed, and then eventually it turned black. And so at that point, they went to the ER. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. The doctors told Richard he would have to have emergency surgery to remove the rotting flesh to stop the spread of this infection. But before they could even do that, they needed to figure out how this infection had even begun. And so at this point, Richard began telling the doctors all about how, 2 days earlier he'd gotten his COVID shot, and pretty much right away it had been so painful, and then it blistered and bled and turned black. And then also, over the course of this discussion that Janet is listening to as well, Richard began describing the NHS guy who had actually come to his house. Now remember, Janet had only seen this guy for a brief second when she had run downstairs. She had seen him walking out the front door, she just saw the white lab coat, but something about him seemed weirdly familiar, but she kind of put that thought out of her mind. But now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy with a little more detail this time, suddenly something clicked. She realized she knew why this guy seemed so familiar. And this realization filled her with horror. It would turn out that NHS nurse was not really an NHS nurse. Instead, they were a man that both Janet and Richard knew very well. However, they were extremely well disguised, and so Janet and Richard did not recognize them. This man's name was Thomas Kwan. And Thomas, after coming inside their home, did not inject Richard with COVID-19 vaccine. Instead, he injected Richard with a deadly pesticide called iodomethane. That pesticide immediately caused that excruciating pain that Richard was feeling that caused him to scream out, and ultimately killed and began to rot away the flesh in his arm. It would turn out Thomas Kwan was Janet's son, and he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. And so he decided he would basically inject poison into Richard, killing Richard to secure the house for himself. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison. You know that feeling when you get totally lost in a story, like you're on the edge of your seat the whole time, start to finish? Well, that's the experience that Audible brings right to you. Are you in the mood for some heart-pounding, spine-tingling suspense? Or maybe an epic quest across uncharted worlds? Well, either way, Audible's got you covered. Whether you're stuck in traffic, hitting the gym, or just winding down after a long day, there's always a story waiting to pull you in. Thrillers, fantasies, true crime, you name it. And the best part is, it's all just a play button away. Unleash your adventurous side with Audible's vast library of entertainment. Discover exclusive, captivating Audible originals you won't find anywhere else. Be the first to experience exciting new releases from your favorite authors. Currently, I am completely sucked in to Island of the Lost by Joan Druitt. It's a real story about these people who get shipwrecked on this totally austere island out in the middle of nowhere. It is fascinating and totally intense. You should check it out. So, what's your next adventure? Find out with Audible. Start listening today when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/MrBallen. On a sunny afternoon in August of 2014, a 24-year-old tourist, who we're going to call Angela Lyons, drove a rented moped through a busy street in Vietnam. Angela had come here about a week earlier from Scotland, where she lived, and so far the trip had been great. She'd been going to nightclubs and partying and eating local food and swimming in local rivers. I mean, all in all, she was having a blast. And now she was just cruising slowly on her moped, looking at all the shops around her and kind of taking in the scenery. And at some point, as she was driving, she turned her head, and then she felt her moped hit something really hard, and she actually fell off her bike onto the ground. She hit her head pretty hard, but luckily she was wearing a helmet, and so she was able to stand up and kind of assess that she was physically going to be okay. And she looked and saw what she had run into, and it was actually another moped. And fortunately, the crash was kind of low speed, and so the other moped driver clearly was physically okay as well, and, their mopeds were not actually damaged at all. And so after she said said she was sorry, and the two kind of just acknowledged that they were just going to go their separate ways. The other moped driver hopped back on their moped and drove off, and Angela, just to make sure she really was okay here, because again, she hit her head pretty hard on the concrete. And so Angela, she took off her helmet and kind of felt around her scalp, and sure enough, she felt a little bump on her head from where she'd hit the ground, but other than that, she seemed fine. Now, because it was a head injury, albeit a small one, Angela did consider just going to the hospital just to be sure. But, as she felt it a couple more times, she's like, you know what, it's pretty small. This is not a big deal. I'm okay. And so she put her helmet back on, got on her moped, and went on about her business. About a week later, Angela was back home in Glasgow, Scotland, and she was inside of her doctor's office about to be examined. Following that moped accident, Angela had stayed in Vietnam for a few more days. And the whole time, she had checked that bump on her head every single day, and it had gone away pretty quickly. However, when she landed back home in Scotland, almost right away, she began developing this kind of startling new symptom that she couldn't help but feel must be connected to the moped accident, and it made her really scared. And so she had gone to the doctor. Her new symptom were these sudden kind of extreme nosebleeds. And so she had made an appointment to go see her doctor to figure out what the heck was going on. And so finally, Angela's doctor came into the room, and he would examine her, and he would look at her nose and her head, and he would listen to her story about the moped. But after he was done with the exam, he would tell Angela that he did not think her nosebleeds had anything to do with the moped accident. Much more realistically, the nosebleeds were from her body adjusting to the weather in Scotland. Vietnam, it was a very hot environment, and Scotland was very cold, and so that shift was likely causing these nosebleeds. And so the doctor recommended that Angela put some Vaseline inside of her nostrils to keep it moist, and just wait for this to clear up as her body transitioned back to Scotland. A few days later, Angela was back home inside of her bathroom looking into a mirror. She was applying some Vaseline to her nostrils. Now, she had been doing this every day, multiple times a day, since the doctor had made that recommendation, but despite following the doctor's orders, her nosebleeds had persisted. If anything, they were getting worse. She was having these things multiple times a day. But for now, Angela simply turned on her shower and waited for the water to warm up, and then she hopped inside. And after a few minutes of just kind of standing under the water, Angela began just kind of touching her nose, something she was doing a lot of, since these nosebleeds had begun. Except as she touched her nose, she began to feel something weird sort of deep inside of her nostril that she maybe hadn't noticed before, and at some point, she actually pushed pretty hard on whatever this was inside of her nasal cavity. And when she did that, it sent this blinding wave of pain over her, and then simultaneously, blood began pouring out of her nose, and she couldn't get it to stop. It was like this flood of just constant bleeding, and it terrified Angela. She'd had these terrible nosebleeds, but this was the worst one, and it was clearly connected to something inside of her nose. And so she's starting to panic, blood's getting everywhere, and she's thinking, this has gotta be connected to that moped accident. Maybe I have some horrible brain injury. Maybe I'm dying here. And so in a panic, she jumps out of the shower, towels off, gets dressed, and rushes to the nearest hospital. When Angela got to the emergency room, a nurse quickly brought her into an exam room and had her sit down and tilt her head back so the nurse could look into her nostrils to see what was going on. And so Angela, she's got all this gauze to kind of trap the blood, and she's got her head way back, and she's letting the nurse do this exam. And after a while, Angela starts to realize that this exam is taking a really long time. The nurse is just kind of standing there, clearly looking at her nostrils, but not saying anything. And, from Angela's perspective, she can't really see the nurse. Her head is tilted too far back. But the silence that's grown in the room is so loud at this point that Angela finally just kind of sits up and looks at the nurse to see what's going on here. And she sees the nurse is kind of frozen, like she's looking at Angela's nostrils like she can't believe what she's seen. And then the nurse kind of snaps out of it and looks at Angela and says, "Stay calm. I'm gonna get the doctor." And Angela's like, "I am calm. What's going on here?" But then the nurse just turns around and speed walks out of the room. It would turn out Angela's primary care doctor had been right when he said he didn't think her nosebleeds had anything to do with that moped accident. This was not a brain injury or anything connected to the trauma. However, her nosebleeds were connected to something else she had done while in Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, in between, going out to nightclubs and partying and trying all that great food, Angela was also swimming in these local rivers. And at one point, when she was in one of those rivers, something found its way into her nose. A 3-inch long blood-sucking leech. It had been living deep inside of Angela's nostril and sinus cavity for over a week, separated from her brain only by this extremely fragile bone that's only about a ½ millimeter thick. Hospital doctors would spend about 30 minutes painstakingly pulling this leech out of Angela's nose, and then once it was out, she would go on to make a full recovery. One morning in February of 1987, a 45-year-old woman named Janet Overton stood in front of her bathroom mirror inside of her home in Dana Point, California. Janet was a member of the board for the school district that her 17-year-old son attended, and she had a big meeting that day. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she looked terrible. She was pale and exhausted, and she had these big dark circles under her eyes. Now, Janet knew why she looked this way. It's because the last couple of days, she'd felt really sick, kinda out of nowhere. She'd been all stuffed up, she had bouts of nausea off and on, she wasn't sleeping very well. She figured she just had a bad cold and hoped if she could just kind of muscle her way through it, she could avoid going to the doctor. But now, here she was, about to have this big school board meeting, still feeling sick, still looking terrible. But instead of kind of canceling her plans and going to the doctor, she just caked on more makeup, did up her hair, and headed out the door. A few weeks later, Janet suddenly woke up in the middle of the night feeling so nauseous that she leapt out of her bed and ran to the bathroom and vomited. And then afterwards, she just sat on the ground sweating and shaking. So over the last few weeks, Janet's cold had not really gone away. In fact, if anything, it had just gotten progressively worse. Now, Janet had gone to the doctor about it eventually, and the doctor had agreed with her that, maybe you do have some really bad cold or some other virus here. But the only thing they told her to do was just, rest and stay really well hydrated, and whatever this is, it'll just run its course. And so that's exactly what Janet had been doing over these several weeks, but it hadn't helped. Janet's nausea had gotten so bad and so severe that she basically couldn't eat. And then she had also fallen behind on her work for the school board because she was so weak all the time. Janet forced herself to stand up off the bathroom floor, then she turned on the sink and began splashing cold water on her face. But as she did that, she noticed something new. She saw there was this red, scaly rash on her arms. And so she stepped back and pulled her sleeves up, and she saw the rash extended up onto her shoulders and up onto her neck and down her back. And when she touched it, it really hurt. This is a brand new symptom here, and she could tell it had to be connected to whatever this mystery illness was, and it terrified her. Like, what was happening to her body? And so she decided that night she had to go to the ER. The next day, Janet laid in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and her husband and her son sitting right beside her. She still felt absolutely horrible. She still felt nauseous, she had cold symptoms, and that rash had now spread up to her neck and onto her face, and it had begun to blister. All night, the doctors had been running tests on Janet to try to figure out what was going on. But every test they ran came back negative. She didn't have the flu, and she didn't have at least any known infections or diseases that could cause these symptoms. And so the doctors were at a loss. However, scans of Janet's abdomen did reveal something concrete. She had all these ulcers in her stomach, which basically are like open sores in her stomach lining. And so the doctors told her very likely it was these ulcers that were causing her extreme nausea and making it really hard to eat. But like everything else they were seeing with Janet, they had no idea why she was developing these ulcers in the first place. And so ultimately, all the doctors could really do for Janet was just treat her symptoms. They gave her ulcer medication, and they also gave her some topical treatments for her rash. And over the next couple of days, these treatments seemed to work. Her ulcers went away, and her rash basically disappeared, and overall she felt a lot better. Not back to 100%, but pretty close, to the point where she was discharged. And so Janet and the doctors were like, okay, we don't really know what this was or why it started. We just hope it never comes back. Several months later, on January 24th, 1988, Janet was at home getting ready for a whale watching trip with her 17-year-old son, and she felt horrible. Ever since leaving the hospital, she had periodically just kept getting sick over and over and over again. And each time she would go back to the hospital and they would just, treat her symptoms because no one could figure out what was wrong with her. And then eventually she'd get better and go back home and the cycle would repeat. And so on this particular day, Even though Janet felt sick as a dog, she just told herself she was going to push through this and try to have a good day with her son on this whale watching trip. So she put on a ton of makeup, she put her hair up, slammed some coffee, and then went downstairs to meet her son. Then the two of them headed outside, walked over to the car, and right as Janet was about to grab the car door handle and get inside, she stood there for a second and then just collapsed. Janet's husband and son immediately rushed Janet to the hospital, but by the time they got there, it was already too late. Janet was dead. Her doctors were obviously baffled because they had been baffled for months now. Nobody knew what was happening to her. And so ultimately they brought in a coroner to do an autopsy to try to figure out once and for all what was going on with Janet. And as soon as the coroner cut open Janet's stomach to examine the contents, he was hit with this smell that was very distinct that instantly told him exactly what had killed Janet. And as soon as he smelled it, he stopped what he was doing and contacted the police. And the police immediately sent detectives to Janet's house, and they began gathering up all these items inside the house to be tested. And the results of these tests confirmed the coroner's theory. As Janet got sicker and sicker, she had this mentality of like, I'm gonna push through this thing and not go to the doctor. I'm just gonna pretend this isn't even happening. And so when she was caking on all that makeup every day and chugging all this coffee, to combat the tiredness, that was all just an effort to, pretend this wasn't really happening. But what she didn't realize is that the makeup and the coffee were actually killing her. It would turn out there was a deadly chemical in her makeup called selenium that was slowly killing her. And then in her coffee was cyanide. And cyanide has a very distinctive smell. It smells like almonds. And that's what the coroner smelled when he opened up her stomach. But these deadly chemicals did not appear in her makeup and coffee naturally. They were put there by Janet's husband. He believed Janet was having an affair, and so he set out to murder her. He first began placing the selenium in her makeup, and it was slowly killing Janet, but it was not happening fast enough. And so finally, on the day of the whale watching trip, her husband put the cyanide in her coffee, and it killed her pretty much right away. Richard Overton was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2009. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen's Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's story is a good old-fashioned scary story that you might tell around a campfire. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please superglue 50 harmonicas to the front of the like button's car right before they leave for work. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Sunday, February 25th, 1855, a 48-year-old woman named Hannah Rallinson, along with her husband and a group of her friends, walked quickly down a road in Sheffield, England. As they walked, the entire group was totally silent because they were terrified of what was going to happen next. Behind Hannah and her friends on this road was actually another slightly larger group of people that were keeping pace with Hannah and her friends. They were actually going to the same place as them, except this second group had no intention of going inside that building. They were just there to see what happened. Now, Hannah and her friends were totally offended and annoyed by this group that was following them, but they knew there was nothing they could do, and so they just kept on walking in silence. And as Hannah walked in silence, she couldn't help but think to herself, how in the world did I get into this position? At the time, Sheffield, England was a big industrial city with lots of metalworking factories all over the place. And so loads of people at the time were coming to Sheffield to work in those factories. And as the population increased in Sheffield, the city began building all these tenement apartments, which are kind of like these low-quality, cramped, interconnected apartments that are basically cheap and easy to make and house lots and lots of people. Hannah and her husband lived in one of these tenement apartments, and they worked in one of the metalworking factories, which meant their lives were pretty rough and difficult. But recently, their lives had become even more challenging when their oldest son had died in a coal mining accident. And this totally devastated the parents, but Hannah definitely took it the worst. In her grief, Hannah became very antisocial and began just going to the factory and doing backbreaking labor all day, and then came straight home. She would go to a room by herself, and she would just sit there all night and pray and try to communicate with her dead son. Now, at first, Hannah's husband basically did the same thing as Hannah. He put all of his energy and his time and his focus on work, even though it was totally backbreaking and miserable, mainly because it was a distraction from this terrible grief he was dealing with. But after several weeks and months went by, Hannah's husband did begin to kind of get back to normal and began to move forward with his life. But he could see Hannah was not doing that. Hannah was totally depressed and isolated, and so he eventually encouraged her to start going back to church and start spending more time with people there, make some new friends, and hopefully being around some people will help you cope with this tragedy. And Hannah had actually taken her husband's advice. She began going back to church, she made a bunch of new friends, she rekindled old relationships, and before long, she was getting that support, and it was helping her kind of move through this grieving process. But ironically, it was this new church support group that had thrust Hannah into a new horrible situation, one that was playing out on the streets of Sheffield, England, as Hannah, her husband, and her church friends speed walked down the road with this big group following behind them. And so in this group of people with Hannah was obviously her husband, as well as her closest friend from church, whose name was Harriet Ward. And then also there was 3 members of the Favell family. There was Mr. and Mrs. Favell, as well as Mrs. Favell's sister. And all of them were headed to the tenement apartment on Campo Lane, where Harriet Ward and the Favell family lived together. Hannah and her group, and the second group that was following them, all came from the same place. They all went to the same church, and that day, for the previous 2 hours before they all took to the streets here, they had been having this really heated argument about what to do about Harriet and the Favell family's basement. Or, more specifically, what to do about what was in their basement. Some parishioners said that Harriet and the Favell family were just totally making up what was going on in their basement. But other parishioners believed them and said that that basement was so dangerous, nobody should go in it. In fact, we should just board up that basement permanently, or we should just level the entire tenement apartment building. And when that idea began gaining some traction, that lots of people in the church began saying, yeah, let's block off the basement or knock the apartment down, the Favell family and Harriet, who lived in this apartment building and did not want to, permanently block off segments of it or knock it down, they got so angry that they just stood up and left. And at this point, Hannah and her husband just got up and left with their friends. Now, once they got outside, they didn't really have a plan, but they felt strongly that they just needed to get to the Campo Lane tenement apartment building and at a minimum, just be in there to prevent other people from showing up and doing something to the apartment, like trying to knock it down or do something to the basement. And so Hannah and her group began speed walking to the apartment, and this gaggle of other churchgoers who were part of this argument just kind of naturally came outside and followed them. And then when Hannah and her friends reached the apartment building on Campo Lane, they went inside and shut and locked the door behind them. And for a moment, Hannah and the 5 other people she was with, they just stood there in silence, not really sure what to do next. But eventually, one of them said, "We got to do something about the basement, because if we don't, the people outside will." Hannah walked over to the front of the apartment where there was a big window that looked out to the street. And when she looked out there, she saw the big group of people that had followed them were all kind of gathering around the small window that looked down into the Campo Lane tenement apartment basement. It was like all these people were jockeying for position to get the best look. Hannah shut the blind in frustration and then walked back over to the group. And then after a few minutes, Mr. Favell said, you know, guys, it's only going to be daylight for a few more hours. If we're going to do something in the basement, we have to get down there before the daylight is gone. We can't be down there in the dark. The group nodded because they understood why. They definitely did not want to be down there in the dark. And then Mr. Favell looked over at Hannah's husband and he kind of gestured like, why don't we, the two of us, go down there together? And Hannah's husband, even though he did not want to go down there, he just nodded and said, okay, let's go. Moments later, Hannah, Harriet, and the two Favell women watched as the two men opened up the basement door, turned around and looked at the women, and then they slowly began descending the stairs. And then after a couple of minutes, the only sound coming out of the basement was the sound of these two men using big metal tools to attempt to break up the stone floor in the basement. For the next 2 hours, Mr. Favell and Hannah's husband continued to smash up the floor in the basement, but every time they removed a big piece of stone, all they'd find was dirt underneath. There was nothing else. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd looking in that window into the basement was only getting bigger and bigger. It was no longer just other members of their church. It was now just random people who saw this big group and walked over to see what was going on. And Hannah, who was at that window looking out into the street, she was seeing this group growing and seeing how rowdy they were getting, and it was starting to make her really nervous. But the nerves she felt about the crowd were nothing compared to the nerves she felt about her husband and Mr. Favell still being in that basement now that the sun was about to set. She did not want them down there in the dark. And finally, when the sun did set and the two men still had not come up, Hannah just rushed over to the basement and yelled for them to stop what they were doing and get up here. And the two men did as she asked. They dropped their tools and came upstairs looking totally dejected. They had not found the thing they were looking for down there, which meant they had failed. But Hannah and her friends were hoping that now that it was dark outside and the people outside could no longer actually see into the basement because it was too dark, that maybe the crowd would disperse. But as Hannah, her husband, Harriet, and the Favells sat down to have some dinner in the apartment, they looked outside periodically and they saw the crowd was not going away. If anything, the crowd was still continuing to get bigger. Now, you got to remember, this is Sheffield, England in the 1800s. This was a tough place to live. Everybody's working at these factories, doing this awful work 7 days a week for very little money, and there's virtually no entertainment anywhere. It's basically just work, work, work until you die. And so when people in Sheffield saw this big group of people at night standing around this apartment window, it was exciting, and that was pretty rare in their lives, and so they were not about to leave and go home because their lives at home were terrible. And so, by about midnight, there was this huge crowd right outside of the Campo Lane apartment, and it meant that, Hannah and her husband really couldn't leave to go back to their apartment. They were kind of trapped because of this crowd. Also, the crowd was really starting to get rowdy, and the Favell family were starting to get worried that a fight would break out near the basement window, and then maybe the window would break, and then these people would storm into their apartment and maybe rob them. I mean, they didn't know. And so Mrs. Favell came up with this plan to try to get the crowd to leave them alone. And so she ran over to one of the biggest windows on the first floor, and she pulled down the curtain rod and the curtain attached to it, and she handed it to her sister and said, go down in the basement and use this curtain rod and curtain to block out the one window this crowd has to look into the basement. If they can't see into the basement, then they'll likely just leave. But Mrs. Favell's sister, after being handed this curtain rod, she's like, I don't want to go in the basement. It's the middle of the night. I'm not going down there. And over the next couple of minutes, the entire group just kind of bickered about who should be the one to go down into the basement to cover up this window. And nobody wanted to do it. And finally, Hannah, who she's lost her son recently, she just wants to go home at this point, but she can't because of this stupid group. She finally just snaps and says, you know what? I'll do it. And so she snatches the curtain rod and just walks right over to the basement door. She opens it up and begins descending the stairs before anybody else could stop her. And as she did, her husband and Harriet and the Favell family, they all crowded around the top of the basement stairs, looking down, kind of waiting to see what would happen.
last night, after I tucked old sing out long into his little lily pad bed, and I had handed him his nice warm glass of fly milk, I was about to leave the room for the night when the little guy sat up and he said, "Papa, narra mihi fabulam," which of course in traditional Latin means, "Papa, please tell me a story." And I smiled and said, "Of course, Lung. I know Lung is a real sucker for lung-themed stories. And luckily, because of our new show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, I'm up to my lungs in lung-themed stories. And so before long, I was regaling old Seagull Lung with a story about a man who believed he was just sick, but it turned out he had a tree growing in his lung. Something I'm sure we all can relate to. Speaking of relatability, if you haven't already, you really ought to check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, because every week we cover totally strange, baffling medical mysteries that all originate from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. You can listen to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries early on Amazon Music, because on that platform, we release them in batches of 8 episodes at once. But you can also listen to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on every other podcast platform. However, you only get one new episode every week. Again, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries is available on all podcast platforms for free, but you can listen to it early in batches on Amazon Music, or new episodes once a week on every other platform. Okay, back to the story. And so they all heard as Hannah turned the corner and walked over to that window, and they could hear her kind of messing around with the curtain as she put it in place. And then even though they could not see her down there, because the basement's totally dark, they can't see the window, they heard Hannah call out that she was done. She had put the curtain up, it's blocked, and now she was going to come back upstairs. But after she yelled to them that she was coming back up, it went completely silent in the basement. And for like 5, 6, 7 seconds, all the people at the top of the stairs are waiting anxiously for Hannah to turn the corner and come up the stairs to safety. But then this tense silence was broken with a horrible scream coming out of the basement. It was Hannah, and then silence again. And at this point, Hannah's husband, he's like, "Oh my God, something's happened." And he charges down the stairs and he looks over and he sees Hannah is lying on the ground motionless. There's nothing else in the basement. It's just his wife and this covered up window. And so he runs over, he scoops her up and he runs her back upstairs and he lays her on the ground right outside of the basement door. And then he began to shake her to try to wake her up, but she wasn't waking up. However, it was clear she was still breathing, and so Harriet ran and got a wet towel, and she came back and she kneeled down next to Hannah, and she placed the towel on Hannah's forehead, hoping this wet towel would revive Hannah. But as Harriet is kneeling there, so she's looking at Hannah's body, and the basement door, which is open, is right past Hannah's body, Harriet happened to look up, and so now she's looking into the doorway that leads down into the basement, and her eyes went wide, and she screamed, and then she passed out. The big controversy over this basement began several weeks earlier at the beginning of February, when Harriet and the Favell family began hearing all these strange sounds coming out of the basement. Now, initially, they had totally written off these sounds as being, strange creaking and cracking sounds that were just the product of a poorly constructed building with lots of people inside of it. But the noises they were hearing from the basement only got louder and louder and more intense, and they were especially bad at night. And so basically, Harriet and the Favell family were so scared to go down there that they just stopped, especially at night. Sometimes they'd go during the day, but at night it was like, no one's going down there. We don't know what's going on, but I'm not going down there. And then on February 24th, so this is one day before all this craziness happened where, Hannah and her friends get followed to the apartment, and then Hannah goes down and she passes out, and then Harriet passes out. So one day before that, Harriet swore she saw a ghost in the basement. She saw this old woman wearing a white gown kind of moving around in the basement, and the whole time Harriet said this woman, this ghost woman, was pointing at one particular spot on the ground in the basement. And then the same night that Harriet sees this ghost in the basement, Harriet has a dream. and in her dream, she sees this ghost. And again, this ghost is in that basement, and it's pointing at this spot on the basement floor, except in Harriet's dream, this ghost woman speaks to Harriet and says that she was murdered and her gold was stolen from her and buried in the basement right there. And it was this apparent ghost in the Campo Lane basement that was the center of that 2-hour-long argument at the church the following day, which ultimately prompted Hannah, her husband, Harriet, the Favell family to get up and storm out to go protect the Campo Lane apartment. And then also the secondary group followed right after them, really just to see if they were going to go confront the ghost, because a lot of people thought that's what they're going to go do. And that is basically what Hannah, her husband, and her friends ended up doing. They decided the two men would go down into the basement and attempt to dig up the floor in hopes that they might find this gold that was stolen from this murdered woman and buried in the basement. But they obviously did not find the gold, which ultimately led to Hannah going down and passing out, and then Harriet also passing out. Hannah and Harriet would wake up after passing out. And when they woke up, they would tell these terrifying stories about what they saw. Hannah said she went down the stairs, she went over to the window where all the crowd was looking in, and she managed to get this curtain up, and then she yelled upstairs to her husband and her friends that she was coming back up. But when Hannah actually turned around to go to the stairs, she realized the ghost was in the basement with her. There was this old woman wearing a white gown standing between Hannah and the stairs. She was blocking her way. And this woman was staring at Hannah really intently. And then Hannah screamed, and this ghost charged at Hannah and basically went through her body. And it was at that point that Hannah passed out onto the ground. As for Harriet, when she came to, her story was even more terrifying. Harriet said after she placed that wet towel on Hannah's head, she looked up and she saw the woman in white walking up the stairs, staring directly at Harriet. And Harriet, she froze and kind of leaned back and just stared at this woman. And the woman, she came right to the top of the stairs. She stopped in the doorway, and then she opened up her mouth grotesquely wide and just continued to stare directly at Harriet. And then with slow, trembling hands, the woman began taking off her nightgown, which eventually fell to the ground. And Harriet saw this woman was covered in cuts and gashes all over her chest and neck. And then Harriet let out a scream, and she passed out too. Not long after Hannah and Harriet both came to and told their horrible stories, the police arrived outside and dispersed the big crowd, which meant Hannah and her husband could finally leave and go back to their own apartment, and they would. But just 12 hours later, Hannah would die. The Sheffield coroner held an inquest into Hannah's death, but he could find no scientific explanation for why Hannah actually died. And so on her death certificate, it basically says she died of fright. She was literally scared to death. Following Hannah's very bizarre and basically unexplained death, Harriet, who would survive, and the Favell family, they just moved out. They could not stand to be at that apartment any longer. And then also many more people who lived inside of this tenement apartment building on Campo Lane, they also moved out because, again, it was just too terrifying to be near this basement. To this day, we still don't have a better explanation for what happened to Hannah. She was in good health, all things considered, when she died. And so really this didn't make any sense. And so this case still is one of the only in recorded history where somebody apparently died just from getting scared.
Late one night in the spring of 1937, a young woman stumbled into her New York City apartment building, drunk from a long night of partying with friends. She made her way up the steps and reached her apartment door, and after she opened it up, she stepped inside and her little dog ran up to say hello, and so she gave her dog a pet, and then she walked towards her bedroom. But the moment she stepped foot into that pitch-black bedroom, something just felt off. It was too quiet. But before she could figure out why that was, something heavy came flying out of the darkness and hit her on the face. And for a moment, the woman just stood there, stunned. And then a second later, something else emerged from the darkness. 2 hands.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast, where we have hundreds of stories, a lot like this one, that are only available on the podcast. They are not on YouTube. Again, the podcast is just called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Today, we're going to learn about 3 places that you're not supposed to go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a scoop of their favorite ice cream, but make sure you sneak an elephant laxative into it first. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On December 20th, 2019, 14-year-old Harley Dilley was on his way to school. It was the last day before vacation, and he was furious with his parents. The night before, he had gotten into a huge fight with them, and as punishment, they had confiscated his phone. That afternoon, Harley did not come home. So his parents called the school to say, hey, have you seen our son? And they said, well, we know he was here today, but we don't know where he went after that. So the parents called some of Harley's friends, and none of his friends had seen him after school. His parents were worried, but they had seen this kind of behavior before. When Harley got really mad, he had a history of running away from the house and staying out overnight. He usually crashed with some friend and they would cover for him, or sometimes he would even sleep in abandoned buildings. And so that day, the police were not called. The next day, when Harley still didn't show up, the parents started to get a little bit more worried, and because their son didn't even have his phone, they had no way of getting in touch with him. And so they finally said, we gotta go to the police. And so the police launched a formal search for him, and right away, there was no leads. Nobody knew where he was. Weeks went by, and the family was putting up posters all over town, telling their son that you're not in trouble, please come home, and everybody in the community is out there looking for Harley, but there was just no sign of him. Finally, almost a month after he had gone missing, the police received a tip. The house across the street from Harley's house was a vacant home because the owners were actually renovating the property, so they weren't living there. But they had cameras set up on the outside, and one of their cameras, when they reviewed it, picked up Harley walking towards their property on the day he went missing. And so the police show up at this property, the owners show up, they give them the key, the police go inside, they're yelling for Harley, they check all the doors and all the windows and everything is locked, there's no sign of a break-in. They go upstairs and in one of the bedrooms they see there's a jacket lying on the ground, and it would turn out to be Harley's. It was the same one he had on when he went missing. And next to the jacket on the ground is this weird metal plate. And so after seeing this, the police believe Harley must be up on the second floor somewhere. He must have been hiding out in this vacant house the whole time. They don't know how he got in, but clearly this is his stuff. And so they start yelling for him and walking around the second floor, and it's silence. There's no sign of Harley. And so they go back in the room where his jacket and his plate is, and they look up on the wall, and pretty high up, there's a hole in the wall. And it looks to be about the same size as this metal plate, and they realize this plate is actually a vent cover, and that is a vent. Suddenly, police believe this could be a lot more sinister, that perhaps someone had harmed Harley and then taken evidence and stuffed it into a vent inside of a vacant house. So one of the officers gets a stool, they put it in front of this vent, they climb on top and they reach in to feel around for more evidence, and as soon as they reach in, they touch something and they pull their hand back out and they say, there's a person in there. And it would turn out the person inside of there was Harley, and he was deceased. Although no one knows exactly what happened to Harley, the leading theory is he climbed onto the roof of this vacant home on the day he went missing, and he looked down the chimney. There was no cap on it, and from his perspective, it looked like he'd be able to fit all the way down to the bottom. But what he didn't know was this chimney was wider at the top, and then as it went down, it got narrower and narrower and narrower, and in fact, the most narrow section towards the lower half, he never could have got through. This was an impossible thing he was trying to do. But regardless, he went in feet first, and he began making his way down, and then about the halfway point, he started to get stuck. And he believed it was because of his big, bulky jacket. And as it happened, he was right in front of this hole in the wall, which was the vent, and so he managed to punch the metal plate off of the vent, he got his jacket off, and he forced it through this hole, thinking that would give him a little bit more room. And it did. He began to sink a little bit further, and then he decides to put both arms over his head to try to make himself as narrow as possible. And it works. He starts to move down, but at some point, he gets completely stuck. And he's struggling to breathe because the chimney is tight on his chest, and he's got his arms over his head, and he's starting to panic, and he lets out a scream. But as soon as he does that, the air coming out of his lungs causes his chest to compress, and he sinks just a little bit lower into that tight section of the chimney. And as soon as he comes to a stop, he tries to breathe breathe back in again, but his chest can no longer expand to its full size, so he can't get a full breath. And so over and over and over again, as he's screaming and yelling for help, he's compressing his chest and sinking farther and farther into this inescapable trap until he reaches a point where he cannot go any lower. And his chest is crushed by the chimney. He can barely catch his breath. His arms are stuck over his head and his feet are dangling off the ground. And that is how he would stay until he suffocated to death. In 2002, Sean Doyle was a 25-year-old bartender who worked at a restaurant in Lower Manhattan in New York City. His regulars described him as a little guy who was very cordial and very friendly. He lived not that far away from the restaurant in an apartment building with his sister Shannon and his dog Emmett. And just down the hall from him was his good friend, 47-year-old Michael Wright. Sean and Michael made an odd pair, not only because of their age difference, but because Michael was actually a huge guy, so the size differential was massive. But they were best buds and they hung out all the time. On December 13th of that year, Sean had just worked a double. He got back to the apartment building and he was ready to cut loose for the weekend. And as soon as he got onto his floor, he looked down the hall and he saw Michael and his girlfriend getting ready to go out for the night. And they flagged him down and said, "Hey, you should join us." And Sean said, "Perfect. This is exactly what I wanted." And so he ran in his apartment, he dropped his stuff, he changed, came back out, and they headed to the bars. That night, the trio had a great time bar hopping all over Lower Manhattan. And then sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, they decided that they'd had enough to drink and it was time to go home. Now, where they were was only a couple blocks away from their apartment building, so they decided they would just walk. And so they get out on the street and they start walking home, and at some point, Michael gets the impression that Sean is hitting on his girlfriend. It's unclear what gave him this impression, but apparently he really believed it, because as soon as he saw it, he launched an attack on Sean and started just beating him up in the middle of the street. Witnesses who lived in the apartments that were overlooking the street would later say they heard a scuffle outside and they looked out the window and they saw a big guy wailing on a little guy. Then, with the whole neighborhood watching, the big guy, Michael, picked up the little guy, Sean, and shoved him. And Sean flew backwards and he ran into this plastic chimney that was over this manhole. It was there to let steam escape and also to make sure nobody went in the manhole. But when Sean rammed into it, it toppled over, exposing the manhole, and Sean fell 18 feet to the bottom of it. As soon as he landed, witnesses would say they heard a blood-curdling scream. It would turn out the hole he had fallen into was filled with boiling water and scalding steam because of a nearby steam main leak. When police and paramedics arrived, they heard Sean screaming from the hole, and so they ran over and they get to the edge of the hole and they try to look down to get a look at Sean, but they're hit with the steam and it's so hot, so they had to back up. And finally the steam clears and they get a look at Sean, and he's just standing in the middle of this hole up to his waist in water. He's obviously in excruciating pain. And he's just reaching up for them, his back is arched, and he's pleading with them to get him out of this hole. They turned off the steam main and they tried to lower something down to him to try to pull him out, but his body was starting to shut down and he couldn't grab on. So they considered sending a person down to try to put a harness on him and try to get him out that way. But even with the steam main off, it was over 300 degrees inside of this hole, so no one could go down there. And so knowing they could not help him, police, paramedics, and other onlookers just had to walk around the outside of this hole with their hands on their heads, listening to Sean's desperate pleas for help. And finally, after 10 minutes of agony, it went quiet. It would take 4 more hours for that hole to cool off enough that they could send someone down to retrieve his body. Judy Melinek, the famous New York medical examiner who did Sean's autopsy, wrote in her book, Working Stiff, that Sean's death was the worst one she'd ever seen in her entire career. His fight with Michael and his fall into the hole did not contribute to his death. His actual cause of death was being steamed alive. But what makes this the worst death ever is that steam burns, no matter how severe, do not destroy nerve endings the way flames do, which means Sean would have felt everything. Michael was charged with second-degree murder. However, it's not listed online whether or not he was found guilty or what his sentence was. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his 3rd deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Kurt, along with 7 people under his his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Kurt called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Kurt. But ultimately, they got it done, and Kurt cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Kurt undid the 3 dogs on his hatch and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Kurt crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch. He undid the 3 dogs. He opened up the hatch. And then using a remote controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Kurt could inspect them through the scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Kurt just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Kurt was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Kurt, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Kurt's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Kurt. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Kurt. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower 2 dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the 2 lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Kurt could have gotten inside of the scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside. And so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up the scavenger air recovery hatches. And it wasn't the sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Kurt. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower 2 dogs and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Kurt's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman completely independently had gone around to the back of the scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it, and he unlocked the 3 dogs, he opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all 3 dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the scavenger air unit, and he said, hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Kurt wasn't in there, and you just checked, right? He's not in there? And the foreman said, yeah, no one's in there, it's all good. And so the 2 of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag. They just left. The search for Kurt continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority and he said, hey, we're down someone. Can you please send someone out to look around? And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Kurt. And so finally 9:30 came around and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave even though they had no idea where Kurt was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Kurt must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier, when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me, and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone, even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found, and so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch, and he heard the sound of them locking all three dogs. At this point, you got to figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is going to become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's going to happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat up until Kurt was cooked alive. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a scoop of their favorite ice cream, but beforehand, put an elephant laxative inside. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Today, I'm going to tell you 2 stories that each of them at first glance will appear to be sort of a run-of-the-mill true crime story. But they are not. I promise you, stick to the end of each of these stories and you'll hear 2 very unique, very sort of unbelievable plot twists. But before we get into those 2 stories, If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and log on to their computer and email love letters to all of their work contacts. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of April 25th, 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle sat in their police cruiser in the parking lot of a public park in Heilbronn, Germany. They were on their lunch break, and Martin was eating a sandwich and looking out across the park, which was mostly empty because it was a weekday afternoon. So Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and it was generally a pretty safe area. I mean, for the most part, the worst crimes committed here were like break-ins or muggings. So Martin and his partner, they didn't have a whole lot of action happening around them. However, something Martin and Michelle and basically all police officers for the most part in Germany were acutely aware of was over the last 14 years, all across Germany, there had been this rash of crimes ranging from, home invasions and robberies to at least 2 murders that had basically all been committed based on DNA evidence by the same person, this singular woman whose nickname was the woman with no face. And she still hadn't been caught yet. And so in essence, all police officers in Germany were sort of like always on the lookout for this woman. She was like the most elusive and sought after criminal in the whole country. But on this particular day, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about how he might get involved in capturing the woman with no face. Instead, he was just worried about his sandwich. And so he went to take another bite of his sandwich when he heard the back doors of his cruiser open up. And he whipped around and he looked, and there were these 2 people who had approached the cruiser, and each of them were carrying a gun. And before Martin or Michelle could do anything, these people raised their weapons and they fired, and everything went black. Within minutes, officers from the Heilbronn Police Department had swarmed the scene. They found Michelle, who was deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. And Martin had also been shot in the head, but he was still alive. He was just unconscious. And so an ambulance rushed him to the hospital while detectives taped off the crime scene and began looking for evidence. Some officers immediately began canvassing the area looking for potential witnesses. But because the park was basically empty all day, there was nobody who had seen the shooting. Other officers looked for footprints in the ground, around the car. They also began looking for fingerprints on the car, bullet casings, hairs, other fibers inside or outside the car. But there was nothing. And so at this point, the investigators are like, okay, all we know is there's been at least one shooter, maybe multiple, because they have not spoken to Martin, who's unconscious. They have no idea what he's seen. So they're seeing that at least one person has managed to come up to a police cruiser, undetected presumably, open up the doors, shoot both officers in the head, and then get away without leaving behind any obvious evidence. It just seemed crazy. Like, have we just missed something? Like, there's got to be something here that sort of points us in the direction of who was responsible. And so in a last-ditch attempt to find something helpful at the crime scene, one officer swabbed the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. They knew that if there was DNA, it could belong to Martin or Michelle or anybody else who might have been inside of this car, and any of those people didn't have to be the shooter or shooters. They could just be people in the car. But it was possible that DNA found inside that car could belong to whoever did this. However, they wouldn't know about this DNA sample until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that could take a really long time. But it was certainly worth it. And so they sent the swabs off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come in, the Heilbronn PD continued trying to find witnesses or any other helpful evidence, anything, but they kept coming up empty. Their only potential witness here was Martin himself, but he was still in a coma at the hospital. It was not until weeks later that finally the police had something to go on, because the DNA results came back. And not only was there DNA found in the car, but what this DNA revealed sent the media into a frenzy and brought this investigation to the national level. At this time, it's mid-2007, And a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Gunther Horn was sitting in his office when he got a call from his boss. And his boss told him, the woman without a face has struck again, this time in Heilbronn. Gunther's eyes went wide and he immediately sat up and listened really intently as his boss explained that 2 police officers in Heilbronn had been shot in the head while parked in their cruiser near this park. And the woman with no face, her DNA had been found in the backseat of their car. Now, Gunther had always been fascinated by the woman without a face, so he was ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Gunther, would lead the investigation into this most recent crime in Heilbronn that was potentially connected to this woman, and to try to finally identify who she was once and for all. Gunther immediately said he would do it, and he got to work. Right away, Gunther organized a task force to investigate this woman without a face. The task force was based in Heilbronn, but at Gunther's command, detectives on the team began reinvestigating all these crimes from all over Germany that this woman was involved in. They searched for patterns, for evidence, or witnesses that maybe had been missed during the original investigation. And through this effort, this team was able to come up with a very rough idea of who this woman was. They knew that she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had a lot of criminal contacts because many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But anytime police had interrogated her co-conspirators, they had refused to say anything about her. It was like they were afraid of her. And there were a couple of other details that struck Gunther as being pretty odd. The only evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of these crime scenes was her DNA. And they didn't have a match in the database to pair it with, so they only knew she was a woman, but they didn't know who she was. In 14 years, she never left behind a fingerprint, a footprint, a hair, or anything else. So it seemed like, her crimes were extremely deliberate, very clean, very well planned, but also she was clearly leaving behind her DNA at all these crime scenes. It almost seemed like that was her calling card. Also, what Gunther and his task force discovered is that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. And this was obviously weird because based on the DNA evidence, they knew unequivocally that their suspect, this woman without a face, was biologically female, not male. And so to Gunther, it seemed like, maybe this man that was being seen at these crime scenes was just one of the woman's co-conspirators, or maybe the woman without a face dressed as a man to avoid being caught. But it was impossible to know without a first-hand witness who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunther really needed. And in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunther got a call about that exact type of witness that he was looking for. That same day, Gunther walked into a hospital in Heilbronn, and he saw Heilbronn police officer Martin Arnold laying in a hospital bed with his eyes open. He'd been in a coma for a month now after being shot, but he had woken up. And he clearly was Gunther's best chance of catching the woman without a face because presumably before he was shot, he might have gotten a look at her. So he was that witness who might be able to describe her. And so Gunther, he walked over, sat down next to Martin's hospital bed, and he asked him to please tell him everything he remembered about what happened. And Martin, he was very distraught about the whole thing. He's just woken up. He's just learned that his partner has died. And so he's very emotional. But he ultimately tells Gunther that, realistically, he can't really remember what happened. He basically turned around. He saw there was, these 2 figures. But after he got shot, it was like he just didn't remember anything. And so realistically, Martin had almost nothing to offer, which meant Gunther was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunther and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros, clocked thousands of hours of overtime, and even offered a reward equivalent to $400,000 for information. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that the whole time this investigation is going on, the woman without a face kept committing crimes. The task force connected her to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And these crimes weren't even just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. So now the entire region was on alert for this woman who seemed like this impossibly cunning international criminal genius.
And Gunter, he couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. According to this officer, the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. They told Gunter that a badly burned body had been found in France, and it was so disfigured that for a while, all police knew was that it was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had come to France had recently been reported missing, and police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork, which included his fingerprints, and they'd been able to lift a DNA profile from those prints. But when they had the DNA analyzed, the results didn't make any sense. And the French police were so baffled by these results that they were now calling Gunter, because they knew if there's someone who needs to know about this, it's Gunter. And so Gunter, after being fully filled in about the baffling results that they had found, he was also at first very confused, but at the same time, he felt this new surge of hope. Because to him, it felt like, as bizarre as this was, maybe this was the break he'd been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the time he was finally going to figure out who this woman really was. So he thanked the French police officer and then brought this new information to his team. And within just a few days, this new information from France did lead Gunter and his team to the woman with no face. It would turn out this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across the entirety of Germany and beyond, appeared to everybody who actually knew her as a totally normal person. Like nobody suspected she was actually responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany, who during the day she appeared to work at a factory, and at night she appeared to just go home. Like she lived a very ordinary life. And so again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that man's fingerprints somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. Primarily because the man was biologically male and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman, that wasn't really possible. And so when the French police saw this, they knew they had to tell Gunter because he was in charge of the woman without a face investigation. And when he and his team looked into this, they figured out something shocking. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, in particular, her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything she did possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line, helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police use in DNA testing. On any given single shift, this woman would touch hundreds or even thousands of these swabs and would accidentally leave her DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer, woman criminal mastermind parading around the whole country. No, there was just a lot of contaminated cotton swabs. And so in essence, police had wasted all this time, nearly 2 decades, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime, chasing a criminal who didn't exist. It was later determined that the police officer Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders previously attributed to the woman without a face are still unsolved, primarily because police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest embarrassments in German police history. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her farmhouse in a small village called Bibongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the whole day working outside on her farm, and now all she wanted to do was grab some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a second. But before she could do any of that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the The sound of this knock actually sort of energized her because she was pretty sure that her 16-year-old son, Bok Chung-soo, had finally come home. So Soo-jin and her son ran this farm together, just the two of them. And they really barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So, to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town, and he also frequently did odd jobs in the village for extra cash. The problem was, Soo-jin's son would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by to tell his mother where he was going first. And remember, this was 1930 in rural Korea, so it wasn't like he could just call her. And so basically, this mother was left to worry about her son kind of frequently. And over the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin did, because she had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he did go, days at a time in the past, doing these different odd jobs, this stretch was a pretty long time for him to be gone. But she told herself what must have happened is he must have found work with a family who was, having him work and live with them full time. That this was just a great opportunity and he had taken it, and surely he would be home soon. And now it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was home. So Soo-jin, she rushed to the front door, she opened it up, and the smile on her face faded immediately because it was not her son standing at the door. Instead, it was 2 police officers. And the first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. And Soo-jin told them that, she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality is she didn't know where he was, and he'd been gone for the past week. But don't worry, he wasn't missing. He was very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he'd be home soon. But after she said this, the police looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces and told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief as they told her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy showed he'd been beaten and strangled to death. And for the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people and trying to figure out who this boy was. And based on everything they'd learned so far, Soo-jin's son was actually the only teenager in the area who wasn't accounted for. But hearing all of this, Soo-jin did not think this could be true. Her son stayed out of trouble and worked really hard. She couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. So she just told the police, this has got to be a mistake. But the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the 2 police officers. And as they led her through the entrance, down a few hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this really has to be some sort of horrible mistake. It has to be. But the second she actually walked into the morgue and saw the body lying on the table, her eyes welled up with tears because she knew it was her son. And to Soo-jin, this moment felt like leaving real life and entering a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds, and he was very clearly decomposing. It was just awful to see. But as this mother is sort of just staring down at basically a parent's worst nightmare here, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and she told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were actually not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, the clothes thing felt very important. So she started rattling off ideas for, where they could have come from. It was like her brain suddenly became fixated on this one aspect to avoid touching on the trauma of losing her son. She began telling them that, maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them, or maybe he bought them without her knowing, or maybe whoever killed him dressed him up for some reason. But when she said that last part, it was like all at once, the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her. She started shaking, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case, so she'd just been at the farmhouse all alone, trying to make sense of his death. But now, Soo-jin sees these officers, and so she goes right outside and she meets them and she asks them, do you have news for me about what happened to my son? And they tell her that she was likely going to have to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't be worse than finding out your son's been murdered, so she said, okay, let's go inside. And so they went inside the farmhouse, they sat down, and then the police told her that they figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both issued full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chung-soo, had worked with at the inn in town. One of them was a young man and one was a young woman. And apparently, Chung-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was planning to run away with a different man from the village soon. And Chung-soo had told the married man about it. When the woman found out that Chung-soo had done that, she was furious. So furious that she conspired with her co-worker, the young man, the other suspect, to lure Chung-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then when they got there, the man and the woman beat up Chung-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the first night that Chung-soo had left the farmhouse. So over that 6-day period, he pretty much went out and immediately was killed. And so over those 6 days, he was never, living with a family and working for them. He was just dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all this, Soo-jin still had one question. What about her son's clothes? Was there anything in the suspect's confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads, no, and said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin, did feel like the clothes have to mean something, she didn't argue or even, try to come up with other theories about the clothes. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to bury him in the local cemetery. And then after that, she did her best to try to move on, but she never could. And as this nightmare kept happening night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. And so Soo-jin basically stopped sleeping, couldn't really eat, certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She actually began to think she was just gonna wither away and die here unless something changed. I mean, this was horrible. She was overcome with grief and sadness and also just scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then on the night of October 18th, 1931, so about 6 months after her son was killed, Soo-jin woke up from yet another nightmare. When she opened her eyes, she saw this shadowy figure at the foot of her bed, and she immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Soo-jin, she wasn't scared. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes, and she actually just began speaking. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Now, Soo-jin really didn't know what she expected to happen here when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have considered, because suddenly the ghost opened their mouth and they spoke. And what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out Chung-soo, Soo-jin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area because he was fearful if he went back home, they would finish the job. They would attack him and kill him. So he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was basically on the run. And so for 6 months, he's living in random towns, doing odd jobs to survive. But eventually, 6 months in, he misses his mom, he misses home, and he goes back and he walks into a room in the middle of the night. He is the ghost. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just says to his mom, "I'm not dead." And he was just being honest. "I'm here, I'm back, I survived." It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who was never identified, by the way, who happened to be in the same area where he had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chung-soo, they're like, "Shoot, that's him, that was us." And they confessed to killing him because that's what they tried to do. They tried to kill him. They didn't kill him. It was some other body. And then when Soo-jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and he basically looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. And she fixated on his clothes and she was like, "Something's off." Well, she was right. It wasn't her son. It was someone else's clothes. And so in the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chong Su had their murder charges dropped because they didn't commit a murder. And they were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, they were never identified and they were buried in a sort of unmarked grave. And the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we're not able to exhume them because we don't know where their grave is. And so very likely we'll never know who that person was.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One evening in August of 2000, a city council candidate stood behind a podium at a high school in small town Alabama. He was speaking about why he'd entered the race in the first place. And he said it was because he wanted a platform to discuss a very important issue. And that issue was the unsolved murder of a local school district employee. And then, right there, in front of all the news cameras and microphones, this candidate said he knew who committed that crime, because it had been revealed to him in a dream. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to your next big house party. But be sure to give them the wrong address. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 4th, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits rushed around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband Barry, who was washing the dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and they were both getting ready for busy days at work. Charlotte was a school administrator, and Barry was the acting mayor of the small town of Lynette, a very tight-knit community of about 9,000 residents. And as Barry left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room, Charlotte, who was pouring herself some coffee, reminded him that she had a hair appointment later that morning, and also that she'd be home later than usual because she had a meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. So Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a legal battle with her cousin Wayne over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had left a lot of valuable land to Charlotte, but Wayne thought that he deserved some of that land too. So basically, he was contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their attorneys were going to meet and attempt to hash it out. Barry asked Charlotte if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. And Charlotte shook her head and said no, and said she was still kind of thinking it over. Now, she knew she didn't want to just give up the land, but she also knew that she didn't necessarily want to risk tearing her whole family apart over money. Barry walked over to her and put a hand on her shoulder and reassured her that whatever happened, the family would get through it. Then he gave her a kiss on the cheek, and he left for work. Once he was out the door, Charlotte left the kitchen and went upstairs and knocked on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. And as soon as she did this, Charlotte heard a groan from inside the room. So Charlotte opened the door up, and she found Kara curled up in bed. And Kara was looking very tired and very pale. But, Charlotte knew this was not just a teenager who didn't want to, go to school or something. The reason that Kara looked the way she did and was sounding the way she did is because Kara was pregnant, and she was dealing with pretty obvious morning sickness. Now, Charlotte was not thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But more than that, she was especially not thrilled because she absolutely hated Kara's boyfriend, Dave Reed. Dave drank and got into trouble with the law, and he just was not the kind of guy Charlotte wanted her daughter around. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had forbid her from seeing Dave. They said, "You cannot date him." But in secret, the two had continued to see each other, and now Kara was pregnant. And so Charlotte really couldn't help but feel deeply disappointed in her daughter. But she also knew her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her.
not just to finish high school, but also to be a teen mom. And so for right now, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. So with that in mind, Charlotte stepped into the bedroom and asked Kara how she was feeling. And Kara just kind of shrugged and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded along and kind of helped straighten up her room for a second. And then she reminded Kara that her older sister Heather was coming home from college that night, and so it would be nice if they all had dinner together as a family. And Kara said, she did have a babysitting gig for basically the whole day, but she promised she would make it home for dinner. Charlotte was pleased and told Kara she would see her later that night, and then she said she had to get to work. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went downstairs, grabbed her purse, and then out the door she headed to the garage to go to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30 a.m., Charlotte drove back down her quiet residential street toward her house. She lived in a respectable upper-middle-class neighborhood where basically all the neighbors seemed to know each other, and historically crime had been very low, although recently there had been a string of robberies in the area which had some people on edge, but for the most part, Charlotte and her family felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, and then she'd gone to the salon for a haircut, and pretty soon she had to get back to the office for a few more hours before her afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. However, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked right after leaving the salon, so first she wanted to stop by her house and restyle it herself before heading back to work and finishing up her day. So she pulled into her garage and ran inside the house and went straight upstairs right to the bathroom. And as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs, and the sound surprised her because she thought that Kara was off at her babysitting gig, and Barry, her husband, usually didn't come home during his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 p.m., Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter, Heather, pulled up to the house. She'd just arrived from college, which was located a few towns away, and she was excited to see her parents and sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something odd. She saw the garage door was open and her mom's car was parked there. And this surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6. But Heather didn't think much of it, so she just grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of grocery bags filled with her stuff out of the back seat of the car. And then as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw the door that led into the house was actually already open, but just a crack, which was kind of odd. Like there's no reason that door would be left open. And so now, sensing that maybe something was off here, Heather walked up and slowly pushed that door open, and she just called out for her mother to see what she was doing, but there was no answer. And so Heather stepped into the house, into the kitchen, and set down her hamper and the bags, and then she began walking around the first floor of the house to just see where her mom was. She didn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She's just walking around, and as she rounded the corner into the foyer, she saw her mom. But her mom was laying at the foot of the stairs, totally motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom and just grabbed her to see if she was okay, but when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold. And so she ran into the other room, picked up the phone, and called 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive, and he'd been very surprised when the dispatcher told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's mayor, Barry Waits. Now, as he pulled up in front of the home, he saw this young woman come running out the front door, crying hysterically. And so Lieutenant Carter, he stopped his car, he got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who begged him to come in and help her mom. And so Carter and this young woman rushed over to the house, and then he told her to stay outside while he went in and investigated. And so she did. She stayed out front and just quietly wept to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door, and right away, right inside, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase, and she was totally motionless. Nearby, the contents of a purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down and felt for a pulse on this woman, but there was nothing. And so Carter, he stood back up and just kind of assessed the scene, and what he noticed was there was foam at the corner of this woman's mouth. So he wondered if maybe she had had a seizure or some sort of allergic reaction at the top of the stairs and sort of had lost her balance and maybe fell down the stairs and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed there were definitely a few drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he noticed there were pretty obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a red mark around her neck. And he realized this woman likely had not just fallen down the stairs. She'd been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled.
If you're hiring, you want a candidate who is passionate about your role, but you can't get that insight from a resume unless you post your job on ZipRecruiter. And now you can try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/ballin. I remember hiring someone who checked all the boxes, but what really sold it was just how interested they were. You could tell they had already bought into the role and wanted to grow with it, and that really made a huge difference. And that was thanks to ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology that finds qualified candidates quickly. And ZipRecruiter has a new feature that shows you the most interested qualified candidates first, so you meet the right people faster. Candidates can tell you in their own words why they're interested in your job. Find candidates who really want your job on ZipRecruiter. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. Try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/ballin. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/ballin. Meet your match on ZipRecruiter.
Later that day, around 5 p.m., Lieutenant Richard Carter sorted through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half hour, he'd been scouring the crime scene for clues, and now he was holding 2 white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots that looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to take the towels into evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood was even Charlotte's, but if it was, it could be a potential clue. After searching the whole house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry, and the TV and other valuables were still in the home. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but her cash and her credit cards were still in her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He thought maybe the killer just kind of dumped out the purse at the end to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a weak attempt. This did not seem like a robbery. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard commotion by the front door, and so he went to go see what was going on, and he saw there was a man out on the doorstep literally being physically held back by 2 forensics officers. And then after a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside, but Barry pushed past them, and right away, he saw what they were kind of keeping him from, which was his wife's body laying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room and sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't. Barry was gasping and really was struggling to breathe. And then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. And Carter thought maybe he's having a heart attack. And so instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 p.m., Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked to see Barry Waits. But the nurse said he would have to wait because they were still running tests on Barry and he couldn't have any visitors until they were sure he was stable. And Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this. Not because he was, desperate to get in there and console the mayor. It was actually because he needed to talk to the mayor. This is the spouse of a potential murder victim. He needed to know what Barry knew. And so he turned to leave, but before he did, he noticed sitting in the waiting room was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather, who, Carter and Heather, they had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day when, Heather was the one who came running out and directed him into the house. They had spoken a little bit, but Carter thought, if I can't talk to Barry, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation right now. And so he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up and definitely recognized who he was and sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter, he walked over, he sat down next to her, and he saw there was actually another girl, a teenager, who was sitting next to Heather, and Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara, and then he asked both women, how was their dad doing? And Heather said that the doctors so far believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was likely a panic attack, but they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed very upset. They had tears in their eyes, they both appeared to be in shock, they hadn't done anything suspicious, really. But Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet, he had to really ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them some questions. So by this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 a.m. that morning, and it was not until about 1 p.m. that her coworkers called her house because she had not come back to work, and they said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. So with that in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they'd been that morning and afternoon, with a focus on 11 to 1. Kara told him she'd been babysitting all day, and Heather said she'd been at her school, her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 p.m. that afternoon when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother, or who might have wanted to hurt their mom, or who might have, been happy if something happened to her. And the girls immediately shook their head and said, absolutely not. There was no one. Their mom was awesome. Everybody seemed to like her, and they were a happy, normal family. There was no issues they knew of. Carter jotted all this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct debriefing with the other investigators on Charlotte's case. He'd listened to the local news on the radio while driving to work that morning, and since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. So Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. Now, by this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out. Neither of the daughters could have been home between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. And so now the other officers were going around the room basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned Charlotte's neighbors and coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, that had not led to any new suspects. And also, another point of frustration was the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this point in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband. But he was still in the hospital and so was not being allowed to speak to them. But just as Carter and the others were sort of scratching their heads wondering what they were going to do next, the front door of the precinct opened, and who walked in but Barry Waits. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital, and they had determined that his heart was fine, and he really had just had a panic attack. So as soon as he was out of the hospital, he'd come right over here to see what he could do to help with the investigation. And so Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard Armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say he left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop was closed, so he went right back to work, and he had stayed there until around 4:30, when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter actually primarily was just looking at Barry's hands and arms to see if there were any scratches or cuts or bruises, because the running theory, based on what they saw at the crime scene, is that Charlotte put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed, and so presumably there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, and probably on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, there were no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. And so, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was, telling the truth and that he was not a suspect here. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was telling the truth. At some point, Carter kind of shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea about who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said, yes, he did. There were actually two people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He said the first person was this guy named Dave Reed, who was actually their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was kind of a bad guy, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. And so Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things got out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem with Charlotte. He explained that his wife and her cousin were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys the same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up in his chair because he thought to himself that the timing here could not be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a word without his lawyer present. And this made Carter pretty suspicious because during this very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he pretty much leaned right in and grilled Wayne. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family. But he said that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. And in fact, she'd been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. And Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself was just not worth it. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised, because Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he'd literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch, something he typically did, like he was at work truly all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. And Wayne immediately looked at his attorney, and his attorney kind of nodded at him, and so Wayne looked at Carter and said, okay. Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish and just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he'd been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, yeah, I do. He'd heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew, given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was absurd. And so Carter actually just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. And Dave would admit that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte, or Barry for that matter, and he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He'd been at work all day at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi. And he also asked him to provide his fingerprints, to which Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, you're wasting your time. But he said he would do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the strings dangling from her neckline and then used them to strangle her to death. She'd also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. Now, this level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints found at the crime scene, and 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was actually unidentified, and it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. Also, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well, so truly his list of suspects was basically down to 0. So if Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, so a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down because Carter and his team had to take time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They'd also investigated another local man who'd strangled his girlfriend in a similar way to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out this small-time criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Also, in addition to these new suspects having alibis, their prints didn't match the prints found at the crime scene, that third set of prints. But sort of adding more confusion to this was an expert told Carter that actually it seems like those third prints could belong to a child, and so maybe were totally unrelated to the murder. And so now, as Carter looked over at this desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress. And as difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to the pressure he was feeling, that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, that was bad. But Carter also understood their frustration, because he was actually feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends here, he was out of ideas. And he had a feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the case had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather graduated college and was, working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much in politics. And in fact, just the previous year, he'd run for a term on city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife, Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the fact that he had a dream about it, all the attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case, and calls had once again begun flowing to this tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and gossip. But that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office, Carter looked up and saw he was visibly excited, like whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him, what'd you hear? The desk sergeant said he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, forensic evidence, and witness testimony, this is what police believe happened to Charlotte Waits on August 4th, 1998. Around 11:30 a.m., the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house and right away recognized Charlotte's car in the garage. And when they saw it, their heart raced with excitement because they hadn't been sure that she'd even be home. But clearly, the killer had gotten here right at the right time. So they parked at the end of the driveway, and they walked up into the garage, and they walked over to the door that led into the house. And they tried the handle and found it was unlocked. So they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away, they heard footsteps on the second floor. And they knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home. So the killer closed the door, they went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them. And Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them standing there. But the killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. And so the killer tried to get her to change her mind, to answer this question differently, but the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument, and then the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte across the face. Blood immediately began pouring out of Charlotte's nose, and kind of stunned, she just kind of stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. Now, at this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line. And so persuading Charlotte at this point to do what they wanted was clearly out of the question. Like, this was a no going back moment. So as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with this towel on her face looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind, and they clutched the strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. And so Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer absolutely had her in this chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. And when the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, obviously motionless, very likely dead, the reality of what they had just done, it hit them. And so in a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped. She was using to blot her nose, but she had dropped it on the ground. They grabbed that, and they rushed down the stairs and kind of cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, and then dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then they grabbed Charlotte's purse off the table and kind of scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor, and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and basically confronted Charlotte and asked her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped and he killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he needed more money. He's thinking, okay, I'm going to get half of this inheritance because she's given the other half to Wayne, but if I kill her, I'll get her life insurance policy, and then together, I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry early on in the investigation was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder, the company would not pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money to their daughters. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Kara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he was. And so it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips to redirect attention away from himself. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Today's story is about a series of very bizarre events that took place in 1983 that, if they had not been so well documented, nobody would have believed this story. 9 people, including 4 police officers and 1 jail warden, officially testified that this stuff really happened. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come to a big fun costume party with you. But when they get into your car wearing their Buzz Lightyear outfit, don't bring them to a party, bring them to a funeral. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On February 24th, 1983, a 21-year-old man named Don Decker walked into a funeral home in the tiny rural town of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where Don's grandfather's funeral was being held. And as soon as Don walked inside, he saw his grandfather's casket open for viewing at the front of the room, and then he also saw lots of his family members and friends of his grandfather kind of kneeled around the casket and, sitting in the front seats of this funeral home, and everybody is quietly crying and kind of consoling each other. But Don, he walks in and he doesn't talk to anybody in his family, doesn't talk to any of the friends, he doesn't go up to his grandfather's casket. Instead, Don sat down in the very last row of seats, he folded his arms, and just scowled angrily as he looked around the room. Unlike everybody else inside of this funeral home, Don was not remotely sad. He was instead just totally angry. In fact, as he was sitting there, he was clenching his fists so hard out of fury that his fingernails were practically cutting into his skin. Don had come to this funeral home directly from the Monroe County Correctional Facility, where he was serving a 4 to 12 month sentence for receiving stolen property. The jail had granted Don a furlough, which is a temporary leave of absence, so he could go to his grandfather's funeral. And Don had jumped at the opportunity, mostly just to get out of jail for a minute, but now that he was actually at the funeral, he kind of regretted going. Eventually, the actual funeral began, and one by one, Don's family members would go up to the podium and say something nice about the grandfather, and then sit back down. And at first, Don, he put up with it, but after a couple people had spoken, Don was just livid. He just couldn't hear any more. And so he tried to focus his attention just on his grandfather's casket, where he could literally see his grandfather's face as he was laying there. And as he was staring at his grandfather's face, suddenly Don saw something and he stood up really suddenly in his seat. And in fact, when he stood up, it immediately caught the attention of the speaker, which was Don's cousin, and the cousin just stopped and stared at Don. And at that point, the rest of the people in the funeral also turned around and looked at Don. And Don, he knew people were looking at him, but he didn't care anymore. He was now so focused on his grandfather because a second ago, he could have sworn he saw his grandfather's lips moving like he was still alive. But as Don continued to stare at his grandfather, expecting his lips to move again, they didn't. And so finally, Don didn't say a word to all these people who were still staring at him, and he just turned and stalked out of the funeral home. Once Don was outside, he thought for a second about heading to the home where he knew his whole family would be going after the funeral, but Don just could not face being around that crowd again, and so instead, he headed to his friend's home. It was this couple named Bob and Jeannie Kiefer, and the reason Don wanted to see them is he knew they were just kind of laid-back people who would not ask him a lot of questions, and they would just kind of let him have some peace and quiet. And really all Don wanted between now and 2 days from now, when he had to go back to jail when his furlough ended, was just to have some peace and quiet. And so Don made his way to their house, and when he got there, Bob and Jeannie were so excited to see him. They called him inside and said, hey, we're going to make dinner, go wash up and relax, and we'll eat together. Don didn't say much, but, he nodded a thank you, he went inside, and right away he went upstairs to the bathroom and splashed some cold water on his face because still, Don just could not shake that anger he was feeling when he was inside the funeral home. And for a second, the splashing of water on his face seemed to be working. He felt like his whole body was getting cooler. In fact, the whole bathroom seemed to have this coolness descend on it. But a weird thing started to happen. Don, as he's feeling this kind of cool come over him, he realized it was actually getting so cold in the bathroom, literally, like physically cold in the bathroom, that it was becoming uncomfortable, like he was cold. And then when Don just happened to look up at the mirror right in front of him, he could have sworn for a second he saw on the edge of the mirror the face of an old man wearing a gold crown. And immediately Don, he kind of freaked out and turned around, but there was nothing there. And as he's like shivering from the cold from being in this bathroom, he began looking all around him, trying to find this old man with a crown on his head, but obviously there was nothing in the bathroom with him. And so Don felt totally unsettled by this. He didn't understand why it was so cold. He didn't know what he had just seen. And then Don happened to look down at his wrists, and he saw there were these deep scratches all over both of his wrists. And so kind of in a panic, Don just rolled his sleeves down to cover up whatever was on his wrists. He didn't want to think about it. He turned off the water and sprinted out of that freezing cold bathroom and just made his way downstairs where Bob and Jeannie were just sitting down for dinner. So Don, he took his seat, he got his food, and he didn't tell Bob or Jeannie about anything that had just happened up in the bathroom. He just sat there and ate in silence. Now, Bob and Jeannie could clearly tell something was on Don's mind, but they'd known him for years, and they knew he was just not the type to come out and talk about anything personal. He basically completely kept to himself, and then when he spoke, he was kind of oddly flat and monotone and emotionless. That was just who he was. But, he didn't cause any problems. He was a very nice guy. And so for this entire meal, Bob and Jeannie just kind of looked at Don, but didn't ask him any questions and just let him eat in peace. After the trio was done eating, Jeannie gathered up their dishes and headed to the kitchen to wash up, and Bob and Don headed to the living room where they sat down and Bob turned on the TV, and for a few minutes the two friends just watched TV. But at some point, Bob realized when he looked over at Don that Don was not really looking at the TV. He was actually looking down at the ground. It was like he was just sitting there motionless, just staring off into space. And Bob thought to himself, wow, Don must be catatonic with grief here from losing his grandfather. But Bob, he felt really bad for Don, but he had no idea what to say to him. He knew Don was not about to launch into some deep story about how he was feeling. And so Bob just sat there and said nothing, hoping that, just his physical presence next to Don was comforting in some way to Don during this really difficult time. And so a few minutes goes by, and the two men are still silently sitting in their seats when Bob begins to hear what sounds like running water. And at first, he looked over at Don, thinking maybe Don had spilled a drink on the ground, but Don didn't have a drink. Don was still just sitting there catatonic, staring at the ground in front of him. And then, Bobby turned and looked towards the kitchen, thinking maybe Jeannie had spilled a drink, but she didn't appear to have done that. And then Bob felt a drop of water land on his head. And so he looked up and he saw water was coming through the ceiling. And so right away, Bob stood up and he yelled to his wife that a pipe had burst. And then Bob, he grabbed his phone and he called his landlord, who lived right nearby, and said, you got to get over here. There's a pipe that's burst in your house. And just a couple of minutes later, the landlord and his wife arrived at the house. The landlord ran inside and he and Bob rushed upstairs to try to find the origin of this leak. And when they got up there, they looked everywhere and there was no obvious sign of where water could be leaking from. The toilet wasn't overflowing, neither was the sink. They couldn't hear the sound of running water anywhere. And then they also realized as they're walking around upstairs that where the leak was coming through the ceiling above the living room, they went to that rough area above the living room. And the landlord was like, there's no plumbing over this area. There should be absolutely no water anywhere near where the water was coming through. And so Bob and the landlord were very confused, and they began walking downstairs to try to figure out what else they could do. And when they walked downstairs, two things happened very quickly. The first was, as they came down the stairs, they were entering the living room where the leak had originally been noticed. And when they walked back into the living room, they saw right away that this leak had grown, and it was now not just coming out of the ceiling of the living room, but it was also now leaking out of the walls of the living room. Basically, all the different walls and surfaces in the living room were leaking water. And then the second thing they noticed was Dawn. Dawn was still sitting on the couch, still just totally catatonic, staring at the ground, not doing anything, which made no sense. Everybody else in the house is running around trying to figure out this leak, and there's Dawn just staring at the ground. And so Bob, who at this point is pretty overwhelmed with what's happening here, but he thought, I gotta make sure Dawn's okay. And so he just walked through the leaking living room right over to Dawn, and he said, Dawn, are you okay? And Dawn, he didn't say anything, he didn't move, but his mouth kind of contorted into this weird smile with his lips kind of pulling away from his teeth, and all the tendons tendons on the top of his hands began to tense as he wiggled his fingers, and Bob, at this point, he realized there's something wrong with Dawn, and they needed to call the police.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I got out of the military in 2017, it was one of the most difficult times in my life. Now, on paper, I was sort of like the best version of myself. I had just retired from the Navy SEAL teams, something I was very proud of, and I had this beautiful young family. But transitioning back into the civilian world was terrible for me. I was depressed, I was unemployed, and I was too ashamed to tell anyone, and so day by day, it was like I just spiraled and got worse and worse and worse. But luckily, my family noticed how badly I was doing, and they gently encouraged me to seek out professional help, to go see a therapist. And I did. I can honestly say I think that saved my life. I was going down a very dark path when I did finally reach out and get help. And so now I can honestly say I am the best version of myself today, and that's largely because of therapy. Now, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're struggling right now, therapy is a really good starting point. And a very accessible therapy option is BetterHelp. They're on a mission to make starting therapy easier, which is why they're entirely online. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire online, and then you'll be matched up with a BetterHelp therapist in as little as a couple of days. And if you don't click with your therapist, it's no issue. You can easily swap for another one at no additional cost. If you're struggling and you think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the story.
Two police officers named John Bojan and Richard Wolbert arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house. And so they came inside, and Bob quickly tried to explain what was going on. But John and Richard, they walked inside and immediately saw, okay, something totally weird is happening here. Because they looked into the living room and they saw water coming down from the ceiling, coming out of the walls. It was even bubbling up all over the floor. And in the middle of all this chaos was one person, Don, who's just sitting there totally erect, not moving, wiggling his fingers with this weird expression on his face. And the police very quickly said to Bob that, we don't know what this is. We don't even know how to help. So we're going to get our police chief. And as soon as those officers left, it was like Bob, Jeannie, the landlord's wife, they were now scared to be in this house. Before, it was just baffling. But now, with Don sitting there tapping his fingers with that weird grimace on his face and water coming out of everywhere for no reason, it was like terrifying. And so the four of them just kind of huddled in the dining room staring at Dawn and the living room until finally the two officers came back with their police chief. But once the chief came inside, things did not get any better because the chief walked inside and he saw how totally weird this was. But his reaction was, this is not a police problem. You clearly have some sort of totally weird plumbing issue that seems very extensive, and your friend, he seems okay, he's just acting really weird. And so the chief told his two officers, John and Richard, to not talk about what they saw in this house and just leave, don't report it, get out of here, we're done with this. And just like that, John, Richard, the police chief, they said, okay guys, your problem, and they left. And then Bob and Jeannie's landlord was like, okay, we're gonna get a plumber over here right away, and you can deal with this. And then they left. And so Bob and Jeannie at this point are totally unsettled, and they just stood in the dining room staring over at the living room where Don was just sitting there tapping his fingers, water's leaking all around him. And then finally a plumber came to the house and they searched the whole house and they could not find anywhere where there was a leak. It literally didn't make sense that the living room was still leaking water. And so Bob, he contacted his landlord and said, what do you want me to do? And the landlord said, you know what? I don't know. We'll send out more plumbers tomorrow. We'll figure it out. And so Bob and Jeannie, they just put out as many towels and blankets as they could all over the living room, doing their best to kind of sop up the water. The whole time they're glancing over at Don, who's still not moving, tapping his fingers, sitting on the couch. And then finally, after Bob and Jeannie had exhausted their towel and blanket supply trying to sop up all this water, they're like, what can we even do? It's still leaking. We can't stop it. We don't know what's going on with Dawn. And so the couple just sat in the dining room, staring into the living room, basically at Dawn, just kind of waiting for him to maybe break out of his trance. And eventually Dawn would, break out of his trance, kind of. Instead of, suddenly standing up and talking to Bob and Jeannie, he just eventually kind of dozed off, still in the upright sitting position. And so at this point, Bob walked over to Don just to check on him and make sure he was breathing and that he was okay. And so he checked, and he was, Don was okay. But Bob noticed that on Don's neck were all these dark red scratches and marks, like someone had been strangling him. And then also on the inside of Don's collar was a little bit of blood. And so Bob, he calls over Jeannie and he's like, "What do you make of this?" And she's like, "I don't know. This whole thing, I don't know what's going on here." And so the couple decided they would just go to bed. Don seems like he's okay. He's sleeping on the couch. We can't fix the water, so that's all we can do. And so the couple, they went upstairs, they went to bed, and the next morning when they came back down, the living room was still leaking, and Don was wide awake again, back in that sitting position, tapping his fingers with this bizarre grimace on his face. And all day that day, and all day the next day, that's where Don would stay, in that position, only stopping to fall asleep, still in that position. And over those 2 days, all these plumbers and different people came over the house, and nobody could figure out where this leak was coming from. And so the water just continued to pool inside of the living room. And then finally, on February 26th, so 2 days after Don had arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house, Don suddenly stood up. He didn't say a word to Bob or Jeannie. He just walked out of the house. And as soon as he did, all the water that was leaking out of the ceiling and the walls stopped. Don would go back to prison, and when he walked into his cellmate took one look at Don, and apparently the look on Don's face was so unsettling that the cellmate immediately called over one of the guards and said, "You got to get me out of the cell. I can't be in here with this guy." And so this cellmate and the guard, they both turned and looked at Don, and Don, he was at the back of the cell and he was facing both of them. And when they looked at Don, that totally weird grimace came across his face, the same one he had on as he sat in Bob and Jeannie's house for those 2 days. It was the same expression, and with that expression on his face, in this totally creepy kind of hollow voice, he says to the two men, "I can make it rain." Now, the cellmate was terrified of Don and was practically screaming for the guard to let him leave the cell, but the guard, who was definitely unsettled by Don and his behavior, he was less scared and more just kind of intrigued with what Don had just said. And he said, "Okay, hey Don, if you can make it rain, then why don't you make it rain in the warden's office?" And after the guard said this, Don's expression, that kind of creepy, weird smile he had, it grew larger and larger until he had this totally bizarre smile on his face, exposing all of his teeth. At this point, the guard now felt totally terrified of Don and understood why the cellmate was so scared of him. And kind of instinctively, the guard just turned and ran into the warden's office to tell the warden what was going on with this guy. But when he got into the warden's office, he looked at the warden, Dave Keenhold was his name, and he was sitting at his desk doing some paperwork, and Dave looked up at the guard, and the guard realized on Dave's chest, his shirt, there was this wet spot that was growing slowly all over his chest. And it was almost like the warden didn't realize it was happening. And so Dave looks up at the guard and he's like, "What's going on?" And the guard, he just points at Dave's chest and says, "Look, look!" And so the guard told the warden about what he had just witnessed in the jail cell and how he had kind of jokingly told Don to make it rain in the warden's office. And now there's this wet patch on your shirt. What's going on here? And the warden, he looked down and he was just as caught off guard by this wet spot on his shirt. And so he leapt up and he and the guard ran back to Don's jail cell. And when they got there, they couldn't believe what they saw. Water was pouring out of the ceiling. It was coming out of the ground. Even the bars were leaking water. And there was Don in the back of the cell, standing there with that terrible smile on his face, and his fingers were contorting. All the tendons were all tight in his hand. And his cellmate was practically crying, huddled in the corner. And so right away, Warden Keenhold moved the cellmate out of that cell, put him in another cell, and then shut the cell where Don was. And then the warden called a plumber to come out here and stop this leak from wherever it was coming from. But the plumber came to the jail, and no matter where he looked, he could not find anything that would cause this leak inside of this jail cell. It just didn't make sense. And in fact, the plumber was so scared of Don, who the whole time this inspection is happening, he's standing in the back, wiggling his fingers with this bizarre look on his face. The plumber was so scared of Don that after he told the warden that he couldn't find a leak, he just left without even being paid. He just had to get away from Don. Now, Warden Keenhold had no idea what was happening with Don, but he could tell it was well beyond his own expertise, and frankly, he had no idea who he should call about what was going on. And so he just called the jail's minister and asked him to come over and see what was going on. But when the Reverend got there and saw Don and saw all the water in the cell, he too had no idea what to do. But when the Reverend walked up to the bars to get a closer look at Don began to move in the cell as well towards the Reverend. And Don, he would stop about halfway through the cell, and when he did, the Reverend stopped as well. And they were kind of looking at each other, and then Don, he raised up his right arm into the air. And when he did, more and more water began pouring into the cell, and also this terrible rotting smell filled the entire jail. It smelled like death. And the Reverend, he was horrified by it, and Don, he was just grinning with his arm up, and then he brought his arm down and began rubbing his hands together and just staring at the Reverend. At this point, the Reverend grabbed his Bible and began reading passages accusing Don of being possessed by Satan, and he was reading all these passages from the Bible to try to banish this evil spirit from Don. And then suddenly Don just let out this horrible guttural scream that was so loud. The Reverend had to stop and cover his ears, and so did the warden and the guard and the cellmate. And then after he let out this horrible scream, it was like Don snapped back to reality and he just collapsed on the ground and began sobbing. It would take Don a long time to finally open up about what the heck had just happened to him, but he would eventually open up to his friends Bob and Jeannie. And while his explanation for what he went through did explain some aspects of what occurred between February 24th and 26th of 1983, it did not explain everything. Don and his grandfather had been very close. However, when Don was just 7 years old, his grandfather began abusing him physically. Don had kept the violence a secret for his entire life, but he had come to view his grandfather as the human embodiment of evil. And so when his grandfather passed away, Don frankly was relieved to find out his grandfather was dead. But when he went to the funeral and he saw all of his loved ones talking about his grandfather as being this incredible person, so loving, so kind, it totally infuriated Don. And as he felt this anger growing inside of him, Don could have sworn he saw his dead grandfather's lips move. And at the time, Don had no idea what to make of it, but he would later say that he believes that was the moment that his evil grandfather's spirit basically possessed him. And Don would say when he got to Bob and Jeannie's house, he began to feel like there was something wrong with him, but he couldn't stop whatever it was. It was like there was somebody else in his brain making him do and say things that he didn't want to do, but he just couldn't stop it. And so he had gone upstairs to the bathroom in Bob and Jeannie's house, hoping to splash some water on his face and make himself feel better. And that was when he saw that old man's face. Well, that face was his grandfather's face. He was wearing that crown. And Don would say he thinks the reason he was wearing a crown is because it signified he had all the power over Don. And then also Don had those scratches on his wrists, which he thought was his grandfather as well. He went downstairs and tried to tell himself that everything was okay. But after Don sat down on the couch, he said he couldn't move anymore. It was like his grandfather had totally took over, and he locked him on the couch with that bizarre contorted expression, and he kept moving Don's hands around. And then obviously the water began leaking in the room for no reason, which Don says was entirely his grandfather. He was just trying to scare all of Don's friends and Don himself. It was his way of tormenting Don a little bit more. And then again at the jail, when the same scene kind of unfolded, Don believed it was his evil grandfather inflicting just a little bit more pain and torment. For almost a decade after this happened, everybody involved in this didn't really talk about it publicly, especially the police and the jailers. They did not talk about what they witnessed because they were worried talking about it publicly would make them look like crazy people and they'd get fired. But eventually in the 90s, 9 people, including 4 police officers and the jail warden, would officially go on the record and testify to what they saw happening. And it would include Don seeming totally deranged and in a trance-like state as water just poured into these rooms that he was in. To this day, we do not have an explanation for what happened to Don. The only explanation that seems to make sense is that Don really was possessed by his evil grandfather. Also, it should be noted that Don never made it rain again. The only times that happened were in Bob and Jeannie's house and in that jail cell from February 24th to February 26th, 1983. After that, Don lived a totally normal life.
Just a reminder, my very first book, Mr. Ballen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. You can find it wherever books or audiobooks are sold. This book is truly a brand new experience for anybody who's a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. We've never had a book before, so this is a big deal. It's a collection of 9 stories. Some are new, some are old, but they're all awesome. The artwork is incredible. The storytelling is just superb. So if you have not purchased your copy yet, or you haven't bought it for one of your friends yet, come on. Go to book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books are sold and get a copy today. Again, that is book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books or audiobooks are sold to get your copy of our first book today.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast, not on YouTube. Again, the podcast is called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.
Today's 3 stories show that no matter how harmless and trustworthy a person might look, you have no idea who they really are beneath the surface until it's too late. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice homemade cherry pie. But don't tell them you didn't remove the pits. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of May 25th, 2023, a student named Jung Yu-jung sat at her desk in her bedroom inside the house where she lived with her grandfather in Busan, which is the second largest city in South Korea. Jung was hunched over with her head in a book, studying for a really important test that she had coming up. But, the words on the page just kind of jumbled together and she couldn't focus, and, Jung just felt really frustrated because she knew, she needed to consume this material and internalize it, but the way she was doing it clearly wasn't working. She really needed help. However, Jung had previously tried to find a tutor, to get help, but finding the right tutor had proven to be very challenging. So Jung had recently signed up for this mobile app that was supposed to connect high school students to tutors. And she had reached out to over 50 people, asking them if they could help her prepare for this really major exam in her 9th grade English class. But everyone she had spoken to either was not available or just wasn't a good fit. But on this night, as Jung stared down at her book, desperately trying to parse through the words on the page, she suddenly heard her phone buzz. And so Jung, who was sort of eager for a distraction here, she grabbed her phone and she saw there was a notification from that mobile app, the tutoring app. So Jung, she opened up the app and she read the message and she broke into a smile because the reply was from a potential tutor that she'd contacted earlier that day that she had been, sort of optimistic about. According to this tutor's profile, her name was Chae-eun. She was a 26-year-old college student and she spoke fluent English. And now, in her reply, Chae-eun told Jung that she would be more than happy to help her and was actually available to start as soon as the day after tomorrow. There was just one downside. Chae-eun tutored exclusively out of her own apartment, which was on the far north side of the city. So it would be pretty inconvenient for Jung to just get there. And then also she knew her grandfather would definitely worry about her traveling that far alone. But after having searched for a tutor for so long with no success, Jung just did not want to pass up this opportunity. So she immediately messaged back that she couldn't wait to get started. And then she and Chae-eun set up their first meeting. 2 days later, on the evening of May 27th, Jung walked up to the tutor's apartment complex. It had taken her almost an hour to get here on the bus. And she'd been lugging, this huge bag with her full of her study materials the whole time. She had brought along basically all of her stuff, just in case they actually got to studying today, which realistically Jung didn't know if they would. This is their first meeting. She didn't really know what to expect. But either way, Jung was glad to be here. This represented progress. So Jung, along with her big old bag, went up to the door with the apartment number that Chae-eun had given her, and she knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and Jung saw Chae-eun standing there with a big smile on her face, and she looked exactly like she did in her profile picture on the app. Chae-eun then introduced herself and shook Jung's hand and welcomed her inside. Jung walked in and had a quick look around, and she saw the apartment was pretty small. It was a studio apartment. There was a bed and a couch in the same main area, and there was a kitchen and bathroom sort of branching off from there. Just then, Jung heard Chae-eun shut the door, and then she walked right past Jung and she took a seat on the couch, and then she sort of beckoned Jung to come have a seat next to her and come chat. And so Jung, she smiled and she's got her bag and she walks over and she sits down next to Chae-eun, and the pair just start chatting. And, Chae-eun asks her to explain again, sort of like, what are your main goals here? What can I help you with? And Jung said, well, I have this big test coming up for my English class, and, I was hoping you could help me with that. And Chae-eun said, yeah, of course I can. I'm fluent in English. I've worked with many people on, similar testing material. So, this is going to be great. And so Jung, she's thrilled, and she says to her tutor, well, like, hey, I brought my stuff. Can we just start the lesson right now? And Chae-eun was sort of maybe taken a little bit aback. This is their first interaction, but she's like, okay, yeah, let me just get a drink of water first. And so Chae-eun, she wanders off into the kitchen and disappears to get her water, and Jung unzips her bag and begins fishing out her studying materials. A few hours later, a taxi driver was driving through the northern part of Busan, scanning the sidewalk for potential customers. And at some point, as he looked around, he eventually saw this woman, who appeared to be maybe in her 20s, standing outside of an apartment complex, Chae-eun's apartment complex. And this woman, she had this large, very heavy-looking black suitcase by her side, and she was waving to the cab driver, clearly trying to hail him down. So the driver pulled up alongside the curb, he rolled down his window, and he called out to her and asked where she needed to go. And the woman told him that she needed to go to the Nakdong River. And this immediately struck the driver as being a little weird, because the Nakdong River was in a very isolated area far outside the city. It was like a really odd place for a young woman to go alone, especially this late at night. But the driver also knew that he could charge the woman a pretty high fare for taking her all that way. So he said, okay. Then he popped the trunk of his cab and asked if she needed help with her suitcase. But she immediately said no, she had it. So the driver just shrugged, and he waited while this woman lugged this heavy suitcase to the back of his cab, and she hoisted it into the trunk, she shut the trunk, and then she climbed inside. And then the driver pulled away from the curb and started heading out of the city. And it was a long, quiet ride, but eventually he pulled up to the entry point for Nakdong River, which was basically a trailhead surrounded by bushes that led into this sort of semi-forested area. At this point, the driver parked, and the woman asked him how much she owed him, and he told her, and so she pulled out her money and she quickly paid him. And then, just out of habit, the driver asked the woman again if she needed help getting her suitcase out of the cab. But again, the woman very quickly said no, she didn't. She would handle it on her own, but thank you. So again, the driver just shrugged and popped the trunk. And then he waited as this woman got out and pulled the suitcase out of the back. Now, at this point, the driver knew, his job is done here. It's not his business what she's doing here. But, it's almost midnight, and he couldn't help but feel sort of concerned about dropping this woman off here, basically in the middle of nowhere so late at night. And he just wanted to make sure that she was okay. So instead of just driving away, he just continued to watch as she walked towards the trailhead. And as he watched her, he noticed that she was really struggling to move her suitcase. I mean, it looked like it was so heavy that she could barely drag it through the dirt. And it was at this point that the driver couldn't help but feel like something's off here. This is not typical behavior. Everything about this just feels weird. What's going on? So, because he had this sort of gut feeling that something was off with this lady, instead of just leaving altogether and continuing his night, he just drove a little ways away from where he dropped her off and then stopped. And he turned and he just watched the trailhead to see if the woman would come back out or if anybody else would show up. And so he just continued to watch, and nothing happened for a while. But after about 20 minutes, he saw some movement, and out of the woods comes this woman. And she still has the suitcase, but now it's plainly obvious that the suitcase is empty, or whatever was really heavy inside of the suitcase has been removed, because she's moving the suitcase no problem. Whereas before,
she could barely get it through the dirt. And the driver, he couldn't help but think, like, what was in that suitcase? Because clearly she has come here to dump it somewhere out in this very isolated part of this area. Like, this just feels really bad. I don't even want to know what she's doing. Somebody needs to investigate this, though. This just feels wrong. And so he turned around, he started driving away, he pulled out his phone, and he called the police. A few minutes later, the woman with the suitcase stood at the trailhead, hoping that another taxi might pass by soon and she could hitch a ride home. And at some point, she saw headlights approaching in the darkness, and for a second, she felt really hopeful, and she waved her hand like, hey, I need a ride. But when the vehicle finally pulled up, she saw that it was not a taxi, it was a police cruiser. And this cruiser came to a stop right next to her, and then an officer stepped out of the car and asked her what she was doing out here so late. And in a very calm voice, the young woman just said she had come out here to drop off some trash because the dumpster at her apartment complex was full. But the officer didn't really seem to be listening to her. He was actually just staring at her big black suitcase. And he actually just asked her, "Can I see what's inside of that?" And this made the woman very nervous. But she also knew that the best thing she could do right now was just continue to stay calm and cooperate. So she nodded and said, "Sure, have a look." And so the officer walked up and he unzipped the suitcase and he flipped it open and he shined his flashlight inside. And it was empty, but it was covered in blood. Like the blood had soaked into the lining all across the inside of the suitcase. But the woman knew this was going to happen. I mean, she knew what was in there and she'd prepared for this. She told the officer that she was simply on her period and the blood he was seeing was nothing more than menstrual blood. But the look on the officer's face made it very clear that he did not believe anything she was saying. And at that moment, the woman's world came crashing down because she knew that despite all the months of studying she had done, she had just failed her test. It would turn out that Jung Yu Jung was not a 9th grade student studying for an English exam. She was actually a 23-year-old woman masquerading as a high schooler. And her very important test was one she had actually created for herself. She wanted to see if she could commit the perfect murder. She had spent months obsessively studying true crime books and documentaries, coming up with what she thought was a foolproof murder plan. And so after coming up with this plan, she posed as a 9th grader and hired a private tutor, Chae-eun. But when she went to Chae-eun's apartment, she wasn't carrying books in a backpack. She was carrying a knife inside of a suitcase. After Jung told Chae-eun that she wanted to start her lesson, Chae-eun got up, she went into the kitchen, she got some water, and when she came back, Jung had gotten out her knife, and she proceeded to stab Chae-eun to death. And then after that, she dismembered Chae-eun's body, put the pieces inside of that suitcase, and then Jung attempted to dispose of the body in the woods by the Nakdong River. But her foolproof plan did not work, because she was ultimately arrested before she even made it home that night. Jung Yu Jung was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday.
On the evening of January 31st, 2012, a 72-year-old retired high school teacher named Norm Johnson was playing the piano in his home in the tiny town of Madison, South Dakota, when his doorbell rang. And Norm was surprised. I mean, not because, just somebody had shown up at his house. I mean, the reality is getting unannounced visitors was not totally unusual in his household. But tonight in particular, it was odd. because the Madison High School basketball team had a big game that night, and pretty much the whole town was there cheering them on. Like, who isn't at the game ringing my doorbell right now? Who would that be? Now, usually Norm would be at the basketball game too. Not only had he coached several sports at the high school during the years he had taught there, but also he had grown up in Madison and he had gone to the high school and he had played on the football team and been on the track team. And, those had really been, in some ways, some of the best years of his life. And I mean, even now, as an adult, he still had such strong feelings and such a strong affinity for Madison High. It was like a home away from home. But despite all that, Norm had chosen not to go to the game tonight because he had just had a long day of meetings for the local boards that he volunteered on, and just in general, he felt like he just needed some time home to relax. And so before he got up, Norm called out to his wife, Barb, who was in their kitchen, and he just asked, like, "Hey, do you have any idea who's at the door right now?" And she yelled back, like, "No, I have no idea." So Norm got up from the piano and went to the door to answer it. When he opened the door, he saw a very unassuming man with gray hair and a beard who was standing out on the doorstep. Norm didn't know who this guy was, which was also just kind of odd, because again, Madison is like a really small town. Pretty much everybody knew each other. But before Norm could ask him who he was or what he wanted, this guy asked Norm, "Are you Norm Johnson?" And Norm said, "Yeah." And then, without another word, the man raised a pistol he was holding and he fired. An hour later, Madison Police Sergeant Justin Meyer parked his car outside of a little brown house that was now cordoned off with crime scene tape. Meyer had been totally shocked when the dispatcher had called him to tell him what had happened here, both because there hadn't been a murder in Madison in almost 100 years, and because Sergeant Meyer knew the victim, Norm Johnson. And so now, Meyer walked up to the house and stepped over a huge puddle of blood right inside the front door. And then he found Norm's wife, Barb, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I mean, she looked like she was clearly in shock. Around Barb on the walls were all these old photos of her and Norm. And some of these photos clearly dated back to the 1950s when they had been high school sweethearts. Norm had been the star running back on the football team, and Barb had been a cheerleader. Meyer took a deep breath, and then he walked over and sat down next to Barb, and he asked her what happened. And she just said she didn't know. She didn't understand. She said that Norm had just gone to answer the door, and then seconds later, she heard what sounded like 2 gunshots. And then, as Barb sort of choked back tears, she said that she had run over and she had found Norm lying on the floor with blood pouring out of his face. And through the doorway, she happened to see this gray-haired man that she didn't recognize, calmly just walking away down their walkway towards his car, and then he just drove off. And Sergeant Meyer, when he heard this, I mean, he really couldn't believe it. I mean, in many ways, he was just as baffled as Barb was about how in the world something like that could have happened, especially in this town. Like, what Barb was describing sounded like a premeditated hit, like an assassination. But Meyer just couldn't imagine who would want to do that to Norm. Like, Norm was beloved by the whole community, and he had been for decades. And so eventually, Meyer left the house and began to speak to all the neighbors. But, as he discovered, pretty much none of them were home at the time of the shooting because they were all out at that basketball game. And then also Meyer discovered that nobody in the area had security cameras outside their houses. And so nobody had captured any images or video of the crime. Because after all, I mean, Madison was typically a very safe area. And so by the time Meyer went home for the night, he was already starting to worry that he might not be able to solve this. However, the very next morning, Meyer got a call from a tipster. And this tipster said that there actually was one person in the area who definitely had a problem with Norm. That was a 73-year-old man named Carl Erickson. And at first, when Meyer began asking some basic follow-up questions, he just couldn't understand how this Carl guy could even be a suspect. I mean, he lived over an hour away in a different town. He was like a retired insurance officer with no criminal record. Like, how in the world would he be the guy that's, assassinating Norm? That just didn't make any sense. There was no clear connection. And then also, there was just the fact that as people, they couldn't have been more different. Like, they definitely would not have overlapped in society. You have Norm, who's like very outgoing and social and beloved, and you have Carl, who's totally a loner, keeps to himself, and for the most part was kind of rude and just people didn't really like him. So like there's just
no reason that these two would come together. But Meyer had very little to go on here, and so he needed to follow up on any lead he really got. So that evening, he brought Carl in for questioning. And very quickly he realized that actually, Norm and Carl do have one thing in common. It would turn out Carl and Norm had gone to the same high school. Carl had grown up in Madison before he moved away. And the past 50 years of both of their lives had largely been defined by who they were as teenagers in high school. But while high school had been Norm's glory days, Carl had a very different experience. He had been an outcast who basically, at best, nobody really paid attention to. And so while Norm is like the star of the football team dating the cheerleader, Carl had actually served as the football team's student manager, who basically ran errands for the coach and assisted from the sidelines. Deep down, Carl was deeply jealous of Norm specifically. I mean, he was popular, he's this jock, he's got all the things that he wanted but really couldn't achieve. And then one fateful day in the locker room after a practice, someone had come up behind Carl and put a jockstrap on his head as a kind of awful prank. And, Carl was not totally sure who did it, but over time, he became convinced it was Norm. Now, over time, the people who were involved in that prank, the football players, they just kind of forgot about it. And in fact, many of them sort of forgot about Carl himself. But Carl never forgot the humiliation. He stewed about it for more than 50 years before his anger finally boiled over and he decided it was time to get his revenge. So, on January 31st, 2012, he drove to Norm's home and he shot him in the face. A few months later, Carl pled guilty to second-degree murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. On the afternoon of August 10, 2011, Detective Inspector John Finch of the London Metropolitan Police walked through the courtyard of the Radisson Edwardian Hotel in London. This was a massive luxury hotel with more than 400 rooms. Finch navigated past the beautiful greenery and the koi ponds and the multiple restaurants until he found the door he was looking for, which was roped off by crime scene tape with a uniformed officer standing in front of it. Through the doorway, Finch could see there were forensic technicians taking photographs and putting down evidence markers. This was a section of the hotel where members of the staff lived in small apartments, and the police had been called here by hotel management because the bodies of 2 workers had been discovered inside, and a 3rd worker was missing. Finch had already been briefed on the basics. The 2 dead were a woman named Alice Adams, who was 20, and a man named Tibor Vass, who was also age 20. And they both had been at the same party in the apartment they were found in the night before. Tibor actually lived in this apartment, and it was actually his roommate, a 31-year-old man named Attila Ban, who was the missing 3rd worker. And this was basically all the police knew at this point. They didn't even have a theory yet on whether the missing Attila was another victim or the killer. They really just didn't know. And so now, Finch greeted the officer who was at the door and introduced himself and showed his credentials, and then he ducked under the crime scene tape. And before long, he found himself standing in this small living room type area where the first victim, Alice, was lying in this massive pool of blood on the carpet. She was wearing a shirt, but no pants, but she did have underwear on, and she had a couch cushion that was placed over her face, and there were stab wounds all over her body. One of the forensics techs warned Finch to be careful where he stepped because there was so much blood all over the floor, they didn't want Finch to step in it. So very carefully, Finch moved around the outside of the room and made his way into the kitchenette, where another forensics tech was picking up items one by one and dusting them for fingerprints and then setting them back down exactly where they were. And among sort of all the items scattered about the kitchenette, Finch noticed there were lots of pill and alcohol bottles. And so now he began to formulate his first theory, that this party they had all been to the night before had gotten way out of hand, and Alice had been attacked in a sudden rage by somebody who very likely knew her. Her missing pants suggested a possible sexual element, and the sheer number of stab wounds on her body and the amount of blood spatter really did suggest the killer was in some sort of a frenzy. The cushion that was found over Alice's face suggested that after the killer had sort of calmed down after the murder, maybe they had felt guilty and couldn't bear to look at what they had done, and so they covered her up. To Finch, this basically felt like a substance-fueled crime of passion. However, when he stepped into the bedroom, the scene inside of there told a totally different story. On the bed was Tibor Vass, the second victim, and he was completely naked, and he had been very carefully posed in this strange position where he was on his back and his knees were bent. It was immediately obvious to Finch that Tibor had not been killed here on this bed. There was only a tiny bit of blood on the sheets, and Tibor's body itself was perfectly clean, like it had been washed, before being arranged on the mattress. And then, when Finch walked over to get a better look at Tibor's body, he saw that the man's injuries were much neater than Alice's. Tibor only had 2 stab wounds, at least that Finch could see, and both of them were directly to his heart. So this was a very efficient murder. And so after a minute or two, Finch sort of backed up and just found himself feeling really confused, because even though he was in one crime scene, there are 2 victims, 1 crime, it almost felt like it was 2 totally different crimes. Like the murder that took place out there with Alice had been messy and very impulsive seeming, and possibly was because the murderer was, heavily intoxicated. And then this murder of Tibor, it seemed like it was committed by somebody who was much more methodical and potentially even sober. And so Finch couldn't help but wonder, how does this missing roommate, Attila Ban, fit into this picture? Because clearly, that's the piece that seems to be missing and likely would sort of answer all of his questions. And so at this point, what Finch decided he would do is he would go track down the other hotel workers who had been at this party the night before, to see if they knew where Attila was or what happened to Attila or why any of this happened. They were there. Maybe they knew something. And so Finch, he turned around and he left the bedroom and he very carefully navigated back across the living room, being careful not to step in any blood. And then he left the apartment. And as he did, he sort of noticed something strange. But right now he knew the most important thing was going and speaking to those other workers to see what they knew. And so for now, he sort of forgot this strange element he thinks he's discovered, put it over here, and just said, I'll deal with that later. And off he went to go find the other workers. Over the next few hours, Finch spoke to a whole bunch of hotel workers, and they were able to tell him a lot about Alice, Tibor, and Attila. Basically, they were all good friends, they all worked together, and they were known for being very responsible and very hardworking. Alice apparently had only just begun working at the hotel a few weeks ago, and coworkers said that she and Tibor seemed to have some chemistry, but no one was sure whether their relationship went beyond a platonic friendship, because Alice actually did have a boyfriend. And Tibor's roommate, Attila, the one who was missing, was apparently a hotel manager. And recently he'd been named Employee of the Year, and everybody seemed to really love working with him. Finch also learned more about the party that Tibor and Attila had hosted in their apartment the night before, during which the murders, must have happened. And apparently it was really just a small gathering to celebrate Tibor getting into college, and the only people in attendance were Tibor, Attila, Alice, and then 2 other coworkers. Finch had interviewed those 2 other coworkers, and they would say that, during this party, this gathering, everybody had been drinking really heavily. But they insisted that it was a calm night without any conflicts or fights. And they both said that when they left the party, Alice and Tibor and Attila were all alive, awake, and totally fine. And so this information certainly seemed to suggest that Attila did it. I mean, he was the most obvious one that could have committed these murders. The 3 were left alone, 2 wind up dead, the 3rd is missing, Attila. But Attila, despite the fact he was missing, which did sort of make him very suspicious, beyond that, he was like this unbelievably sweet guy who had no problems with anyone. He was like the Employee of the Year. It just didn't track. Nobody thought Attila could have done this. Nobody. The fact that Alice had a boyfriend, but apparently was, getting close to Tibor and, sort of going beyond being just platonic, that was intriguing to Finch. Coworkers said Alice, flirted with Tibor a lot, and Finch thought it was definitely possible that maybe the boyfriend had come to the apartment and found Alice and Tibor together being sort of inappropriate and killed them out of jealousy. It felt like a very possible theory. However, that would explain why Alice's body was in the state it was in, but that theory would not explain why Tibor's body had been posed in such a bizarre way, or also what happened to Attila, like where's Attila? Now, Finch knew that all day his team had been pulling surveillance video from around the hotel. So in the evening, around 7 p.m., he went back to the station to start combing through the footage. He wanted to get his eyes on every single person who entered and left the employee housing area on the night of the killings. The hotel really was covered in cameras, and odds were the killer would be somewhere on those tapes. But later that night, when Finch finally got to the end of all the footage he was given, he was baffled. So the surveillance video didn't actually show the doorway to Tibor and Attila's apartment. It just showed the area around the building that contained the apartment. So Finch could only see who entered and left the building, not the individual apartment. So that was a limitation. But he could see Tibor and Attila and Alice and those other two party guests enter the building before the party, and he could see those same two party guests leave hours later at almost the exact time they had told him they left. There was no sign of Alice's boyfriend at all, which meant he very likely was not the killer. Otherwise, you'd see him somewhere on this tape and he just was not there. And so as disappointing as that was, it, made sense and it at least sort of progressed the case. But Finch is also thinking, the thing the footage also doesn't show is what happened to Attila. Where is Attila? On the morning of August 12th, so 2 days after the bodies were found, Detective Finch went back to the apartment, now with his team of detectives. Attila, at this point, was still missing. Nobody knew what happened to him. And that was actually why Finch was back here with his team. He wanted to take a second look around, not just the building and the apartment, but really the whole area. Because they had traced Attila's phone and it was pinging off a cell tower right next to the hotel, as if he was still here. But, keep in mind, by this point, police have searched the whole grounds, including every room, all the closets, all the utility areas. They've looked everywhere on this property and they have not found a trace of him. But Finch thinks, what else can I do but just keep on looking? So now, Finch and his team greeted the officer who was still standing guard by the crime scene door, and the officer let Finch and the other investigators in. And pretty much the second Finch stepped back inside this apartment now for the second time, he knew something was off. Finch had been staring at crime scene photos for the past 2 days obsessively, and as a result, he really had a good feel for how this place had been left. Because remember, when they take photos and when they, dust for prints and all that, they try to leave the scene exactly the way it is because it's all evidence until, the case is solved. But as soon as he walked in, he saw there was a vodka bottle that clearly had been moved. And his first thought is are you kidding me? Is this us? Are one of our techs moving stuff and not putting it back? Are we tampering with our own evidence? Or worse, has somebody somehow broken in here and moved things around, without our own guards knowing about it? What's going on here? And at the same time, Finch is faced with this new reality here. One of the other investigators pointed to the bedroom door, which was closed. And he said that he'd been here when the forensics team had left, and he was positive they had left that door open. And so Finch is totally flabbergasted. He walks over to the door and he turns the doorknob and tries to open it, but clearly there is something blocking the door, somebody put something on the other side of the door to keep it from opening up all the way. And so at this point, Finch and the other guys began basically ramming on this door until finally they were able to push it open just enough that they could look inside. And when they did, they find the missing third person, Attila Ban. He's lying face down on the bed, he was naked, and he was covered in blood. It would turn out the murders did take place during that party. The killer was there with Alice, Tibor, and Attila. And the killer, at some point during this party, after those other two guests had left, they saw Alice and Tibor kissing, and it drove them mad with jealousy. And they grabbed a knife, and for a short period, they went into an absolute frenzy, repeatedly stabbing Alice brutally until she was dead, and then turning their attention and stabbing Tibor twice in the heart. And so they had brutally killed these two in a total fit of rage. But the killer knew there were some loose ends inside of this apartment.
And so very carefully, they slinked their way into the bedroom, and with that same knife they had just used to kill those two, they cut open the side of the mattress, and they crawled inside, and they waited. When Detective Finch first left the apartment, like that first time he was there and he's leaving to go speak to the hotel workers, when he opened the apartment door and he began to leave, he stopped because he noticed something weird. He didn't pursue it right then and there because he wanted to prioritize the interviews, but what he noticed was there's so much blood inside of this apartment. It's everywhere. Like the texts are telling me to be careful where I step so I don't track blood around. But he's looking down, like he's just opened the door to the apartment, and there's no blood leaving the apartment. All the blood is contained inside of the apartment. How is that possible? Well, the reason it was possible is because the killer never left the apartment. And so fast forward 2 days to August 12th, the same day that Detective Finch and his team came back to the apartment to do another sweep. So earlier that same day, the killer is still inside the mattress, but they know now they have to deal with Attila. And so very carefully, the killer slides out of the mattress they've masterfully been hiding in for the past 2 days undetected. And for reasons not fully understood, they ended up moving some things in the apartment, like that vodka bottle that was moved. And then also they went back inside the bedroom with Attila and they barricaded the door shut with something heavy. So they're barricaded inside the very room they've been hiding in. And now it's time to deal with Attila. And so the killer gets on the mattress, and they take their own clothes off, and they cut their wrists. Because it turns out the killer was Attila. They are the same person. And Attila was madly in love with his roommate, Tibor. And at that party, when he saw Tibor kissing Alice, he knew that his love was unrequited. And it threw him into a rage, and he stabbed and killed both of them. And then he sort of arranged Tibor, his love, in this sort of strange position, which probably was because he had such strong feelings for him. And then also when he attempted to take his own life 2 days later, when he staged his own death on the bed there, he sort of arranged himself in the same pose. But again, he didn't die. And so after Finch and his detectives broke into the room, they found Attila. They were able to get him to a hospital and treat him. And then once he was stable, he was arrested, found guilty of the murders, and sentenced to 26 years in prison.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.